We've already discussed that Hannah has 10 minutes and she's got one tabled item in front of you, elected members, with some pictures. And if, Hannah, you finish in less than 10, we'll be able to have some questions. Thank you. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou, ko nuku ao tuku kāinga nāianei, ko ngai tahu, ko Ngāti Kangunu te iwi, e rua oku tamariki, ko Grace Rawa, ko Bella, oku tamahine, ko Hannah toku ingoa. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my kōrero about tiny houses. I saw you, sir, at the weekend at the co-housing meeting, and I can see that there's a real need for different groups in Tauranga Moana to work together to meet the social, housing and environmental crisis that we're facing. Tiny houses are legally home-built caravans. The reason I've tabled mine is you can see it's a caravan, but it does also kind of look like a house. They're usually 7 to 9 metres long, 2.5 metres wide, and they're registered and warranted vehicles that can be towed behind an SUV or a ute. That said, it's a caravan, but it's homey. I think that I'd like to start by explaining that the kōrero in the mainstream media is often misrepresenting what the tiny house movement is about. It's often sort of suggested that it's a financial driver. However, this is quite misleading. For myself, I've been a homeowner since I was 21, and I decided to sell up a big 5-bedroom, 2-storey home and downsize. I wanted more green space and less carpet space. It was driven by a minimalist movement and a desire to own less and value more. I dropped my hours to have more time with my kids and a big garden. We own more than 7,000 square metres in Pies Pa and enjoy a big permaculture food forest, chooks and bees. For us, tiny is also a tiny environmental footprint. I ride my bike to work, my kids use city buses, and I think that you'll often find this is the desire of many who go into the tiny movement, environmental factors. To us, tiny homes also reflect our more modern lifestyles. We've been in several locations in 3 years that we've owned our home. The ability to tow your house along behind you and take a little slice of the known with you is very appealing. Even on our site, we move it about, here and there summer, here winter, and tweak the angle. I think too it reflects our desire for both privacy and community. As discussed at the co-housing meeting, this model presents people with the opportunity to live in their own space, but in shared ways. Many of those that I know who are looking towards this model are looking to meet multi-generational housing needs, providing support as they age and closer ties to mokopuna. Living in closer connections with others is a main reason for many of us. Most of the people I know in tiny homes are well-educated professionals. Most people I know have at least a bachelor's degree or own their own business, and this is part of a wider view. We're not people who are one step up out of living in our cars. And it was this local area's need for specialists and behaviour supports in education that brought me and my family here to Tauranga. In choosing my current site, I was quite methodical. I'd heard a councillor speak at a tiny house meeting down in the Mount, and he said that the council was really looking into this as a potential urban infill solution. I carefully selected a rural residential zoned land without covenants on the advice of my lawyer. He checked the titles and we consulted with city planners to make sure that we wouldn't be doing anything wrong. We went through the test cases that have been to the High Court. We were trying to be very careful that we were acting in a way that was fair and reasonable. But Freeburn Road, where I live, is kind of fancy. But despite this, the locals have been really supportive. I cannot count the number of people who have come down the drive with a bag of fruit, a bottle of jam, or just a smile to say hi and tell us how much they love our little whare. They love the massive efforts with the food forest, they love the goats, and how nice it is to see kids outside climbing trees, not playing on computers. Since I've been there, I've had so many people ask if there's room for one more. And I have said yes. I've let a lady park her tiny house there while she saves up for her own place. When her marriage fell apart, she was left trying to find a rental somewhere, anywhere, near her kids' school. We've also had 2 older ladies in RVs who are there sometimes. They own an RV and their kids are all grown up, but here in Tauranga. Forced out of their homes, they've been freedom camping out and about quite happily, but as many of you know, there have been recent changes to the freedom camping zones, which means they're often now stuck with nowhere to go. And they are some of the 50,000 New Zealanders who live full-time in an RV or caravan. These ladies are fully self-contained and they just literally park somewhere safe overnight. They use dump stations up in Pies Park and do things in the proper places. They're often gone for weeks or months at a time. And when they stay when they need a safe place to pull in. But that said, it's a small community of all women. We provide support for one another and help with this or that, looking after kids or the gardens, we pull together. What I wanted you to know is that it's been really difficult dealing with the Tauranga City Council, despite all of our best efforts in advance to make a good informed choice. When I wanted to get my septic tank installed, one of the engineers added the requirement for an RPZ valve to my approval. No one told me that this had been added or what it meant. RPZ valves are restricted for the most dangerous areas, things like hospitals or chemical treatment plants. And so far, nobody, the city planner, the compliance officer, the drain layers, no one has been able to tell me why this costly and seemingly over-engineered piece of equipment was added to my consent. So far, the drain layer has been convinced it was an error, and I haven't even been able to find anyone who will put one on a domestic system. They're convinced it's a mistake. Now, the compliance officer seems to be suggesting that I might need to apply for resource consent to be a camping ground, just to live on my site, even if I ejected everybody else, just to live on the land I own in my tiny house. He hasn't been super unkind about it, but even the city planner I spoke to said that as long as the other ladies in the RV are not there more than 3 calendar months in the year, then we're fine and I shouldn't need to eject anyone. She agreed that we're doing nothing wrong and that the compliance officer appeared to be overreaching to find some way we were not compliant. When he came, he was threatening me with a $350 a day fine because he'd copied my email address down wrongly from my consent application, and he'd been trying to get in touch with me, even though it was his error. I've acted in good faith. I took the word of the council that there was some support. I was very careful about choosing a site. On my site, I comply with all of the restrictions, such as overshadowing neighbours or not having RVs there for more than 3 months. We've gone and gotten a council-approved septic system. There's no funny composting toilet business. But it's been hard, really hard. It's felt as though my journey with Tauranga City Council, I'm trying to colour inside the lines, but you all keep moving the page. I need your help as elected members to intervene in pointless bureaucracy and help us get to some solutions. There is a big community of tiny houses, and we're parents and business owners and ratepayers. We're law-abiding people who are trying to live in an ethical, sustainable and healthy way. We'd like you to work with us to provide us with a sense of safety. We don't want to have to be a holiday park just to park our caravan in a paddock or outside our mother's home. We're a small city of 50,000 people who are living this way, and we do need some clear legislation. Because there's no clear rules, it seems that every one of the people I come up to is coming up with worst case scenario and making the route very difficult.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that presentation. We have time for a couple of questions. They will be questions, of course. Members, thank you. Anyone wish to ask? Hannah, have you approached any elected member for assistance through this process?
No.
I think you'll have some willing hands and hearts.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I think we will look into it, won't we? The Mason?
Oh, thanks, sir. Have you any of your friends or colleagues in the tiny house movement put their houses in the Western Bay District Council area? Because I understand it's a lot easier. Is that correct?
Western Bay, I was parked in Western Bay, and Western Bay were fine with it, and that is certainly what I've been told by people. If you move a few hundred metres up towards even the Kaimais, then you're fine, but Tauranga City Council was specifically difficult.
Last question, Councillor Robson.
Sort of two questions, if I may. How many people are on the site sort of permanently? How many people live on the site permanently? 7,000 square metres?
So there's me and my 2 children who live there full time, and then there's this other lady, Jess, with her 2 children every second week.
Okay.
So we're way below the 8 full-time residents that we're allowed.
Can I ask a supplementary? How green or sustainable is that sort of, one of the big issues we face as a city is shortage of space. So 3 people stroke 6 people on 7,000 square metres of land. That's an extraordinary, in some ways, amount of space for a very small number of people to occupy.
Yes.
How sustainable is that conceptually?
Well, I think that if there was clearer permissions, I would happily have more people. But
Okay.
this has been my zoning is for a maximum full-time occupancy of 8 people.
So it's our rules that are
It's
making
your
it.
rules that I'm
Okay.
trying
No,
to comply
I just
with that are restricting it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, again for that, and yeah, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Chairperson's report. There won't be one this morning. We have quite a full agenda with the long-awaited ABLI reports to work through later in the program. Acceptance of any late items, there are none, I believe, at this stage at least. Confidential business to be transferred into the open. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I just, having read the ABLI report, and the confidential one, I just wonder why it's in confidential.
Jeremy, would you?
Because there are land sites in there which we don't own that we're talking about, and we haven't been discussing that with the landowners.
Thank you for that. It's only a few parts of the report, so I just raise it, and whether that could be redacted then and the rest put into the open.
It could be looked at potentially when we've been through the report. It's a normal tradition that we don't, make it aware that we are looking at private properties when we're in an early stage of evaluation. But I agree, there's many parts of the report that perhaps could be. So we'll talk about that when we get into the confidential. That's okay. And take some advice. Any other matters on confidential to be released into the open? There are none, so change to the order of business. I think I'd like to move that we do bring the item DC 114, natural hazards, ahead of the bus interchange update so that we can deal with both open and public excluded with ABLI present. So if that would be seconded by someone. Thank you, Councillor Granger. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. We're hoping that we'll move on to the reports with ABLI just before lunch and then be able to deal with that after lunch through. We're aiming at finishing at 3, so we have the update on the elections with Warwick Lamp, the electoral officer, at 3. But if we do take more time with that start, we'll just have to slide a little. So then we come to a declaration, confirmation of minutes, please. We have the minutes of the meeting 12th of March in the open section. Are there any amendments? Councillor Brown?
Yes, on page 15 of the agenda, 8 of the minutes. Points raised by elected members, the third bullet point down, supermarket development should be on private land, not council land, should be market driven. That was the comment of a couple of elected members and not all. It reads as though we all have that view. So
Yeah.
if it could just be noted that some commented, because we haven't made that decision yet.
Yes.
Page 15 of the minutes.
Yeah, I was actually speaking with staff about that just before we started and asked if we could insert points raised by some elected members into that heading. I was told that there is a review going on about the headings for some of our minutes so that it can be a bit clearer. So I think we often think it's been a majority sort of view rather than one person. So if that can be taken care of. Councillor Stewart.
So in the same vein, on page 13, points raised by elected members, the third bullet point states intensification important for the younger generation in terms of affordability. I certainly don't hold that view, so a similar vein to Councillor Brown's comment before.
Yeah, okay. I think that would apply the same. But I think as this review goes through, we'll find the headings change a bit to reflect that. But we'll deal with that one as well. Anything else, Councillor Robson?
Just a suggestion, if I may, may not be a heading issue. Points are normally raised by one person by definition. If the name of the person raising the point was put against the point,
Yeah, it is a possible approach. We'll see how the review goes forward. There is one other matter there at the end of the minutes, just to note, DC 55, we said that the report would be moved into open at the end of the confidential. We are signing off on those confidential minutes today, so that's when that process can then follow through. So, is there a mover for the minutes to be accepted? Thank you, Councillor Mason. Seconded, Councillor Clout. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. So we'll move to DC 86. Progress on the intensification plan changes, and ask our staff to come forward. Oh, sorry, I've missed conflicts of interest. Are there any conflicts of interest in the agenda today? There are none. That's fine. Thank you. Thanks, Barbara. Thank you, Andy, and
just testing how these things work. So, good morning. I'm just going to hand you over largely to Janine Speedy and to Carl Luca to present around progress around the intensification plan changes, which cover the city living, commercial and residential zones, which we are progressing at the moment and looking to notify before the upcoming local body elections. I think you all know Janine. Carl has presented to you before, as you may recall, when Becca undertook a review and some work with us around the upcoming city plan review and how that should dovetail with the current plan change work underway. So Carl works for Becca as an urban planner and urban designer with a lot of experience in this space. So I'll just hand it over to you guys and I might chip in a little bit as we go. Thanks, guys.
Good morning. So the report that's put up, DC 86, is covering the intensification plan changes. So as you remember, in March at the last Urban Form and Transport Development Committee meeting, the city planning team provided a quarterly update which covered all plan changes that are currently being progressed through the team. And so this one is taking that next step, providing you an update on kind of where we've got to so far, what we're looking to change within the city plan to provide for some intensification through the zones that Andy pointed out, and the engagement that we've done to date and that we'll continue to do prior to notification of the plan change. So, yeah, as I just said, the whole premise behind these plan changes is to provide a enabling rule framework, or to enable infill within our existing suburban residential, commercial and city living zones. So we have spoken to you in the past about our development capacity constraints that we're facing within the city, our need to look for greenfield options for further housing, but also within our brownfield for intensification. This has been outlined, I think, it has been outlined in the future development strategy, and also is quite clearly outlined in the Tauranga urban strategy as well. So what we're looking through these plan changes is really to, at a very basic level, is to provide for a variety of housing typologies. So what we see in our suburban residential currently is generally single to double story standalone dwellings, but through this rule framework we really want to provide for a variety of housing typologies, from the single story standalone but to duplexes attached into some more comprehensive developments over larger sites. What we need to do through these plan changes, therefore, is to look at our objectives and policies and how we enable that, making sure that where we have more comprehensive development that is encouraged and provided within appropriate locations with quality development. And what we also need to understand is that we've got the infrastructure to support that intensification, and also that we are covering off our natural hazards requirements under the regional policy statement. Campbell Larking will be presenting later on natural hazards and can provide a little bit more background in terms of the natural hazards assessments that we're currently undertaking to cover off those requirements, and that will feed into these plan changes as well. So this is Appendix A to your report, the slide that is up there at the moment, because I realise the text is a little bit small. So this is looking at scale of change. So from the work that we've undertaken to date is understanding how far we can take these plan changes at this point in time to provide some different outcomes, some variety of housing typologies that we can achieve within the timeframes that we have. And then there are other things, so point 4 and point 5 are things that we would like to look at as part of the city plan review, which will go a little bit wider in terms of how we provided housing, and some more comprehensive review of especially the suburban residential zone, and also how we can align our city plan with the national planning standards. So you might be aware that national planning standards have now been finalised, and we as a council are required to align with the zones that are provided to us and the definitions. So that will be part of the city plan review. But basically the scale of change that we're looking at for these plan intensification plan changes is in the 1, 2 and 3, and that's providing for a rule framework for duplexes, for comprehensive development, so more than 2 dwellings on a site, having appropriate assessment criteria within our rule framework to ensure that we have quality outcomes. So as you'll understand, that when we have increased intensity, so greater density on a site, we need to ensure that that amenity and that usable open space, things like overshadow and setbacks, is really appropriate within that local context. So we really need to work carefully about what our assessment criteria look like. Other things that we're reviewing is, which is under point 3 of that scale of change, is, as I said, looking at what our site coverage of sites are, what our setbacks are, how we provide for open space, and also what car parking requirements are appropriate. So with the increased density, we're looking at a kind of a variety of housing typologies. So our first one is a duplex, as we said, so that's providing for more than one dwelling within a site. We're looking with increasing or providing for duplexes is to generally keep the same provisions that we have in the city plan. So that's things like retaining our height of 9 metres, retaining our site setbacks, and from the side boundaries, the front and rear boundaries. But so in terms of keeping the same envelope, but within that site being able to achieve 2 dwellings. So rather than having a large 4 to 5 bedroom dwelling on a large site, you may be able to achieve 2 dwellings, so a duplex with 2 bedrooms, keeping the same kind of building envelope. So we're working through that, what those performance standards are to retain that building envelope, but maybe have slightly smaller outdoor living space, but ensuring that's usable. Those are the kind of examples that we're looking at. And then moving into the framework of medium density. So we're looking at, that's a comprehensive development. So we're looking at things like activity status, which is likely to be restricted discretionary at this point. And as I mentioned before, is about having appropriate performance standards to allow for that kind of medium density, and also having appropriate matters of discretion. So when an application comes in, we provide a clear direction from a council of what we consider appropriate for medium density, and also have really strong matters of discretion, be able to ensure that we have really good outcomes. In terms of moving into detailed provisions and looking at what these performance standards are, matters of discretion, we'll be doing quite a bit of testing to see what that looks like on paper. So that's working with our key developers that work within Tauranga to see what the outcomes actually happen, working with architects to see what the built form would look like, but also looking at the financial feasibility to say, well, would this actually be feasible to build in reality? So this is Appendix B in your report, and that's really looking at and explaining the scale of change and where that is appropriate within our city. So the suburban residential secondary dwellings, that's how it sits within the city plan at the moment. That's generally the suburban residential zone, and we have permitted performance standards, and we are looking at moving into providing for duplexes within that as potentially a permitted activity status as well. But going into detailed provisions will really be where we understand what the activity status is and what provisions are appropriate to allow this kind of housing to happen. Then we move into our medium density comprehensive development, as I said, with appropriate performance standards and matters of discretion to ensure that we have really good outcomes. This will be promoted within areas or within the city that are appropriate, which Carl will go into soon. We're also looking at the commercial zone having the same kind of a comprehensive development to ensure that our residential happens within appropriate locations. And as you'll all be aware, we're reviewing the city living zone. At the moment, it's quite complex to work through a consenting process. So we're looking at, again, a comprehensive rule framework, but making sure it's very clear, it's enabling, but essentially the built form outcomes will be exactly the same, very similar to what you can actually do within the city living zone at the moment.
Maureen, everyone. So I'll just pick up from where Janine's left off. Look, in terms of providing for medium density, the two key outcomes are, having it in the appropriate places. So thinking about that, and then doing it well. So it needs to be designed well to fit in with the existing context. So there's a number of supporting pieces of work going on in the background to these plan changes. One of those is a suitability analysis. So starting to looking at where our existing amenities are, so open spaces, schools, neighbourhood centres, and public transport in the main, and starting to align where intensification or higher densities may occur in relation to those amenities. The other piece of work that is also happening is we're starting to look at design guides or a residential outcomes framework to ensure that when we do see more intensive development or medium density development, that it's undertaken in a really well-designed manner. And that's about getting our developers on the same page and our planners and all those other people who are using in the community and using the district plan. So in terms of what that starts to look like, in terms of this diagram, the outer area, so the more opaque area, is your suburban residential, and that's where we'll see duplex development and a lower intensity comprehensive development. So that really fits in with the existing amenity values of our general suburban area, but it still allows for a bit more intensification so that we start getting that maximising our use of land in those areas. Moving into our peripheries, areas around city, neighbourhood centres and along corridors are the areas that we'd expect to see that medium density comprehensive development occurring. So potential there for slightly more height and slightly more density, but still recognising the important amenity outcomes we want to occur in those areas. And then you move into your town centres, your city living zone on the city centre periphery, where again you see a step up in terms of the scale of development. And you know, in fairness, we're already seeing that in around the city centre and along some of our corridors. And then obviously the city centre is where we see the greatest scale of development. So in terms of the suitability mapping that we're undertaking, we're taking examples that have been worked through in Christchurch, but it was also used as the basis for the Auckland Unitary Plan. Hamilton and other districts are now using this. So this is just an example of what that starts to look like. And what you'll see within this area is they started mapping those areas around the open spaces, the schools, the neighbourhood centres, and they were able to provide a suitable rating from suitable through to most suitable. The most suitable being the darkest sort of splodges showing up there around the open spaces and so forth. And where Christchurch landed in terms of was adopting those most suitable for medium density development as a restricted discretionary activity, and this is now being carried through to their district plan. So as I say, this is a piece of work that we're undertaking in the background to help us inform and provide an evidence base for how we approach these plan changes.
Excuse me, through the chair, can the purple colour be explained, please? I can't read the writing on the legend.
So the purple was neighbourhood centres in that case. So you had, sorry, they're secondary schools. Apologies, can't read it here. So schools, open spaces, and apologies. So as I say, in terms of quality of outcomes we're looking for, so we understand that we can't just provide for development to occur without some control and a process around the form and quality of that development. So we are working through an outcomes framework, which really the three things that focuses on the on-site amenity for the future residents of those dwellings, the interface with the adjoining neighbours, so ensuring that high quality amenity can be maintained, and then the relationship with the street and the public realm, so particularly along corridors and those key places, and interfacing with open space and so forth. As noted there, an urban design panel is a possible future step to assist in achieving these quality outcomes, but in the meantime council has confirmed a number of urban design roles within its new structure. So there will be the expertise within council to follow through on the process.
Just if you could just pause there, Carl, maybe just while you're on the urban design panel, can you just tell us what other cities have an urban design panel in operation?
Auckland Council and Hamilton City Councils both run urban design panels. A number of other councils work in slightly different ways. Waipaha District Council, for example, has an agreed urban design reviewers that provide, and Christchurch City Council has had a panel approach, but also identifies and has a panel of appointed reviewers as well. So there's a number of approaches in there. Both Auckland and Hamilton cities, it's non-statutory, so they run through that process. It's given regard through the consenting process, but
but the feedback from those panels remains non-statutory.
Can you just elaborate on how the panel is established, if it is? We're not making a decision on that now, but just to give a bit more clarity. It's not staff, it's a...
No, so the Auckland Council is made up of a variety of professionals. They call, they open up a process and call for nominations. So they have, I think there's about 5 or 6 will sit on any panel at a time, when applications come through for review. But they have, the wider panel consists of in excess of 18 or 20 from memory. And so they'll be called upon, and they include a range of disciplines, urban design, landscape architecture, planning, and transport-related disciplines. And generally, they'll look to form a multidisciplinary panel for to review. Depending on the application, it may go to the panel once, may go through a number of times, and they'll look for consistency in terms of who's reviewing that.
Just on that, is it supplementary?
No, it's a general question. Do you want to go back to the end if it's general questions? Yeah.
Wanting Carl to explain a little bit more about that urban panel there. Carry.
So in terms of engagement, so we are taking a very proactive approach to engaging with particularly key stakeholders, those in the community who are actively involved with development, and those in the community who have shown an interest in these plan changes and the need for medium density development. So this includes the Housing Affordability Forum and the Property Developers Forum, and quite a number of developers, some of whom you've heard from previously. We're also engaging directly with their own consultants and some of the other planning and development consultancies in the community. The reason we're being very proactive about that is it is about lessons learned. It's about understanding where things have worked, where they haven't, what they feel are some of those key constraints, and then we need to weigh that up against what we feel are the non-negotiable quality outcomes we're trying to achieve. So we're working through that with a number of those stakeholders. We're also engaging with tangata whenua, and we will be looking to go out to particular community representative groups as we work through this process, and then undertake, when we get into the notification phase, undertake a very meaningful consultation through that with the wider community. So in terms of next steps, I think as we've alluded to, there's a number of work streams going on in the background, the outcomes framework, residential outcomes framework, suitability analysis. There's also work around hazards, which Campbell Larkin will touch upon more later. These are all feeding into the development of those more detailed provisions, along with engagement with key stakeholders, which will continue on an ongoing basis. So it becomes quite an iterative process. We put something down as early as possible for key stakeholders and others to comment on, and then keep building on that to get to the right place as we move towards notification. And we'll be coming back to yourselves, accounts, elected members, on a number of sessions to work through the provisions in a bit more detail and ultimately work towards approval for notification.
Just one question in regards to the medium density. Will there be any set ratio between the building structure and the open spaces?
So the quality outcomes are really important in terms of this. So where we're approaching that is if you look at it on a continuum of I guess, your suburban areas through to your city centre, there's a higher expectation for on-site amenity and open space in your suburban areas, and as you move towards those towards the city living and city centre, there'll be less expectation for I guess communal or shared open space on those sites, but there will still be a requirement for private open space, balconies and so forth. So we're moving away from a density requirement, but we will hold fast on the necessary I guess open space requirements for residents on each of those sites, and it'll be.
So what you're saying, there is a set sort of rate in a sense, that there won't be any variance allowed as regards to. So in other words, if the builder or the owners wanted that little bit more in the way of building rather than open space, will there be a chance of any flexibility?
So there definitely will be flexibility. So we're looking at using a restricted discretionary activity status, and where elements such as open space are really a conversation between council and the applicant, and council really represents the future users in that regard. The restricted will set a baseline, so there'll be an expectation of X square metres of open space. Where that isn't met, then it will become a discussion as to, well, how are we ensuring you're providing good amenity for the future residents on that site? And the assessment criteria will open that pathway and open that ability for that discussion without not closing the door to the applicant, but enabling that discussion. Yes. So it still needs to be, a good quality, but that flexibility will be there.
I just want to hear that word, you're not closing the doors.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the end of the presentation, is it, Andy? Thank you. So we'll move to more questions. Max, Councillor Mason was next, then Councillor Stewart, Councillor Brown.
Thanks. I'm not sure who's going to answer. Thanks for the presentation. I'd just like to explore is the assumption that a dwelling is a dwelling and it doesn't matter who owns it? Or I noticed that you not only speaking to the developers but also the social housing providers, housing affordability, etc. I'd just like to explore what difference there is in the typology if it's a rental, basically, if that would affect the planning and the rules, and just also I see that you don't have in your stakeholders the Tauranga Property Investors Association. You might want to include them. Yep. Thanks.
So in terms of the city plan, we don't look at the ownership, so whether it's a rental or private ownership. The reason why we are going out to a number of social housing providers is because many of them own quite large pieces of land. They are looking to develop, and also they're looking to provide for a variety of housing typologies. So for example, when we talk to accessible properties, they're looking to deliver 2-bedroom dwellings. That's where their market is, that's where the demand is for them. That's very similar with Housing New Zealand, so we've already met with Housing New Zealand to discuss their plans for the future in terms of delivery of housing. And at the moment our city plan is not exactly set up for a 2-bedroom dwelling, just because of the minimum lot size. You can deliver it, but sometimes it's not feasible, and so through this rule framework, enabling duplexes or for a comprehensive development of a larger site in a suitable location, we're looking to be able to enable that kind of housing that these social housing providers have a very strong interest to deliver, hence why we're doing quite a bit of stakeholder engagement with them.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. 2 questions through the chair. On page 28, under number 3, in the last bullet point, it mentions reduction of car parking for comprehensive development. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
So with the current car parking requirements within the city plan, I suppose firstly to note that the city plan was made operative in 2013 as a result of the last full review. So we're quite a long time down the track. And so as part of these intensification plan changes, we're looking to review residential car parking requirements. At the moment, for an independent dwelling within the suburban residential zone, it's 2 car parks per dwelling, and that is irrelevant of the size of the dwelling. So even if you were to deliver a 1-bedroom dwelling, 2 car parks are still required. That reduces when you get to your more comprehensive, so your medium density type development. But what we're looking to do is we are having a external consultant who is a traffic engineer to review those requirements and advise us whether those are actually appropriate or whether we should consider an alternative car parking requirement in the different zones or for the different kind of housing that we're looking to deliver.
And the other question was a comment towards the end of the presentation about non-negotiable quality outcomes. Could I have a bit more detail on that, please?
Sure. Look, I think when we're looking at providing higher density development, we need to ensure it's done well, but we also need to, ensure that we're still enabling development. So in terms of those outcomes, we're working through both site standards, so that will relate to things like open space provision, access to light, so both within the site and potentially internally. Elements such as outlook, so ensuring buildings aren't squeezed right up on one another. And then also provision of, for example, minimum dwelling sizes, in relation to the number of rooms. We also will have a number of assessment criteria which sit alongside any application, so which will consider, the overall site amenity, how it addresses the street, and how it's configured on the site. So it really is, council's playing a role to, I guess, protect the amenity for future residents using those, because we want good outcomes, but they also play the role in terms of, their interface with adjoining sites and with the public realm. So it's looking to ensure that we get good outcomes on those 3 fronts, while still enabling higher density development that responds to, I guess, the need for housing choice within this community.
If I can just follow up with that, with those requirements and with regard to cost, have you done any work, or will there be any work done on the price ranges that reflect these standards and requirements?
So there are, nationally there's a number of existing pieces of work that have been done. Ministry for Environment has done some work around that, and then also through the unitary plan hearing, significant amount of evidence was brought forward in that regard. So the actual quantifying the cost of additional outdoor living space and so forth. So it is about finding a balance between those. Again, remaining enabling for those people who are developing, but also protecting future residential amenity. Ourselves, we've had a number of reports prepared. Tauranga City Council has had a number of reports prepared in terms of identifying some of the key constraints around development from a developer's perspective, and so we're taking those into account, and they include some of those matters. The provision of identifying that in some cases too much open space is required on site, or the setbacks are overly onerous. So that's those are the elements that we're continuing to investigate to try to find that balance. And to close it out, we will go back to those same, the authors of those reports to say, well, this is how we've responded. Do you think this is responding to the enabling element? So both national and locally, we're building an evidence base for that.
If I can just jump in as well, I think I'll just take a step back and look at the process as well. So we will at some point notify these plan changes, and they'll go through a very robust consultation process, including submissions and also further submissions where all the key players, developers, social housing providers, etc. can be involved, and where there are issues and perhaps remaining issues where there's differences of opinion, those can be settled through that process.
Councillor Brown next.
Thank you. My questions are around engagement, and point 33 in the report says that engagement will be undertaken in accordance to Schedule 1 of the RMA, which sounds like it's the bare minimum of what's required. We've just recently had some projects reviewed, and one of the outcomes was that there was a failure of engagement plans. And we could do all the planning in the world and get it all right, but if we don't get the comms right and the engagement right, we may fail, and we have failed in the past. So I guess on the back of our visit to Christchurch, we saw exemplary community engagement around their cycleways and what they did. So how robust is our engagement plan going to be? Are we going to see one that rolls out over a period of time so that we make sure that we don't drop the ball on this?
So in terms of the requirements under the RMA, that is obviously the bare minimum, and it's up to us as a council in terms of how we deliver that engagement. So as we've outlined, there's our pre-notification, so that's where we're at the moment, and that's engaging with our key stakeholders, our housing providers, but we're also starting to have the discussion of how we can start engaging with the wider community groups who have an interest in the delivery of these of housing. When we get into the actual notification of the plan change, there is a minimum requirement of 4 weeks, but obviously because these are significant, well, in terms of the built form and the general suburban residential may not be significant, but it is a change to our current rules within the city plan. We've already started discussions about what that will look like, and it will definitely include wider engagement with the community in terms of open days, and also I think from previous experience of progressing a plan change, there's it's really important for us to be able to explain to the community how they will become involved in the process. So explaining what a submission is and how you need to put across what your key issues are, why would you put in further submission, how you can present at a hearing, that you have the opportunity to express your concerns through written form and spoken and things like that. So we are looking at quite a extensive notification process and engagement process with the community as well, and an engagement plan has been drafted. But I think another important point which has come across quite strongly from already our developers is about if these plan changes progress and they do become operative, it's also about, once they're in the plan, how we improve the process. So I think the example that you heard in the public forum is a good start of how we engage with our applicants, how we make it quite clear what our information requirements are so everyone's on the same page, and that's from a pre-application meeting where resource consent is required right through the building consent process. So our view is that we are looking obviously strongly at the city plan requirements, but it's also at the full development process from pre-application to actually code of compliance, just to make sure that we work well with our community if they are looking to, develop.
If I could just add to that, I guess what we're dealing with here are some plan changes that deal more or less across the whole city. So we're dealing with our our whole community, 130, 140,000 people. So that does put some limitations on I guess, in the way we can engage, because we can't engage directly with, I guess, every one of those people. So we need to do it in a broader sense. But there are a range of related projects underway as well, and I look at the Te Papa Spatial Planning Project, and we'll take quite a different approach to engagement around that, which will be more community specific because of the specific geographic area, and that deals with a lot of these same issues around change and intensification. So through that process, there will be some crossover and overlap with some of these plan changes.
Thank you. Just a supplementary to that, you were talking before about getting a consultant in to review the residential car parking requirements. I would hope that part of that would be engaging with the current users so they can give you first-hand experience of what issues they see and what they experience on a day-to-day basis. Those people that, like particularly the city living zone, what their issues might be. So that's real engagement, that's getting the real nuts and bolts from those people that are living and breathing it every day.
Okay, Councillor Robson, then Councillor Malloy.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, if I may. Just a couple of quick observations about Councillor Brown's two questions. I hope you've got a decent budget for engagement, because it's not going to be cheap. So I hope that's in there. And with regard to the parking thing, it's not just the city living zone. There are parts of Papamoa where we've consented residential development, and frankly the parking is a shambles, and the street widths are inappropriate, and the whole thing is just a cluster bubble. Now, to my questions, how high up is affordability, housing affordability, in your objectives for this intensification? Is intensification designed to deliver affordability, or is it actually designed to protect green space? Where does affordability sit in your objective outcome matrix, which I'm sure you have, for this large and expensive project?
Comment on that, you can jump in as well, but a lot of people, I think of intensification as the solution around housing affordability, and I guess we take a view that it can contribute to delivering less expensive houses, but it's not going to solve affordability, if you can just put it that way. And then when you take that down to the next level, looking at specific rules, I guess there's that balance around things like, you know, how many car parks, how much open space do we need, and what impact does that have on the cost of delivering the housing. So there's a balance there that we need to strike that will factor in affordability, but it won't be the overriding consideration necessarily at all times.
Thank you. Are we talking to Western Bay Planning District Council? We are, as the chair points out regularly, I think the fourth smallest TA. We're surrounded by one other authority. In terms of getting rules, you know, are the rules going to be significantly different between Te Tumu and Te Puke? And what will that mean in terms of the divide? We've already had reference this morning to, hey, tiny houses in Western Bay, cool. Tiny houses in Tauranga, meh. So are we talking to Western Bay?
Yes, so we have regular catch-ups with Western Bay, their policy team, on a regular basis, and that is to cover our urban growth areas. So they are progressing a number of 3 plan changes. Their plan changes in terms of to do with earthworks. They're also to do with fencing, and they are doing a residential plan change. Their residential plan change doesn't, it's a little bit different from ours, but we're definitely comparing notes and having regular catch-ups.
Thank you. With regard to flexibility, it always worries me a little bit. I'm looking for reassurance, I suppose. We wind up with the development that I've seen recently created, or in the process being finished down in Owens Place, which must miss just about every basic requirement for proper urban planning in creation, and was actually criticised by, or appeared to be criticised by, one of our own staff members in a news article in the paper. So how are we controlling flexibility so we don't wind up publicly shooting ourselves and criticising ourselves?
So I mean, that is a key issue at the moment. In the commercial zone, there's no requirements around ensuring development happens in the right type of places, or it's designed in the right type of way. So all the matters that Carl has spoken about are not covered to any degree within the plan at the moment. So we're looking to introduce those provisions to balance that flexibility with those good outcomes.
Thank you. If we don't have another one of those, I'll be very happy. You made a comment with regard to tying it into current public transport routes. Make the observation that our current public transport routes, I don't know whether they've been effectively thought through. There is a lot of discussion in our community, and our current public transport is very much a bus service, which is actually quite easy to change the route to. So are we going to lead this work with bus routes that regional council may decide in their wisdom, and they don't have a lot, but in their wisdom, their limited wisdom, change on us? Who's in charge here, us or them? I hope it's us.
So at the moment, in terms of public transport, we are using high frequency routes as the basis for that type of planning, and so they're the routes that are most likely not to change. You know, Cameron Road, for example, and a number of other key routes, and then we tie it to bus stops in terms of that location. So they can move a little bit, but and we're continuing to have a dialogue with regional council to ensure.
I think just on that, if I could just comment on that. The way we're looking to do this, you know, and Carl talked before about, let's say, you know, the suitable areas for medium density development are around schools, open space, public transport and commercial centres. We all know those things can all change over time. So we're not looking to map those things in the plan and say this is where development or medium density development can happen. But we'll talk about those things in the plan, and then as they change, we can have maps that sit outside the plan, so there can be some flexibility as the world evolves around us.
You've had your allocation of questions, Councillor Robson, Councillor
Sorry,
Malloy, and
to
then
the chair, there is
Councillor
no
Carrack.
allocation. and
There
one
is. We have a timetable to follow through on. I'm going to go to Councillor Malloy now, and then Councillor Carrack.
Two questions, if I may, through the chair. Time frame for this, for the plan change to be operative, and the other one is infrastructure. Does that need to go in before the plan change, or can the infrastructure follow the plan change? I'm talking about transport and all three waters, the necessary infrastructure for this plan change.
So we're working, so the first question in terms of timeframes. So if we're to keep to our current project plan, which is to seek notification by August, it's generally a 2-year process from there. So you're looking at 2021, mid-2021, before it will become operative. That is, of course, dependent on things like appeals. But once we get to the appeal stage, there is opportunity for us to put parts of the plan as operative. So, for example, if we have an outstanding matter that just sits purely within the city living zone that's an appeal matter, we may be able to make the rules within the suburban residential operative sooner than that. Yeah. And there's the second question? And the infrastructure. So we're doing, that's part of our, going into our detailed provisions. We need to be satisfied through these plan changes that we are able to deliver infrastructure, that it's either already there or whether we're able to deliver it as part of, or the developer is able to deliver it as part of that development. So that may change what the activity status of some of these rule frameworks are, but it will definitely, for our medium density, it will be a consideration, is that the infrastructure is available or will be delivered as part of the development.
And the thing is that in many parts of our city, there's significant infrastructure already in the ground to support more development. So in much of the city, this development shouldn't be constrained by those factors.
Councillor Carrack and then Councillor Morris.
Mr Chair, enabling housing is our most critical issue in Tauranga. So before I start my questioning, could I ask how many questions will you allocate to me, please?
Generally 2 or 3 questions is sufficient
Three.
for each member if we're going to finish on time today.
Okay.
This is an update to us on an ongoing process that's very complicated.
Sure. Okay. Would it be okay if I could transfer one of my allocated questions to Councillor
No, it
Robson?
would not, Councillor Carrack. Make your questions and then we'll move on to another member.
I'm prepared to forfeit all my questions if Councillor Robson could continue his questions.
Well, that's very generous of you, but I won't allow that. I'll go to Councillor Morris if you're not going to ask questions.
Is it you, Rob?
In that case, look, I'll limit my questioning to one. I know we're pressured, even though housing is the most critical issue in Tauranga. And if I could ask, when we talk about enabling development in the medium density zone, from a developer's perspective, some certainty is fairly critical. And in terms of being able to roll out or actually even consider such development would require amalgamation of sites, obviously. But when there's uncertainty there and we've got restricted discretionary, and discretionary introduces uncertainty, obviously. You know, a permitted activity would be fairly easy, and a developer would be confident to look at purchasing a number of sites to amalgamate in order to deliver medium density. So in the discussions that you've had with developers, is that the key message to deliver certainty, and what has been your response? Because this is, you know, I'm not a developer, I don't know, but it's so obvious that having that degree of uncertainty isn't going to deliver. And I understand the report that Auckland has, and how they've got around this problem.
Okay, I'll speak to that, and Janine might add in as well, because we've both had a number of meetings with some of the key developers and stakeholders in the recent weeks. Look, I guess at the moment, you know, within the suburban residential zone, if you are to undertake any type of comprehensive or higher intensity development, will be fully discretionary, likely to be notified, and likely to go through a hearing process. The restricted discretionary approach that we're providing for would effectively identify a number of matters that would be looked at, so it starts giving them a bit more certainty as to where council's discretion is. Gives them a lot more certainty, but we'd also look at non-notification of those applications, generally provided that they meet this the overall bulk and location standards, so particularly things like height. If they're going to jump up a lot in height and it's going to affect neighbours, then obviously we need to open up that discussion. But moving to a restricted discretionary status, and this is really best practice across New Zealand in terms of being able to deal with the design matters that you need to be able to have a discussion about and get the good outcomes, allows that discussion, but also gives greater certainty. And so all the feedback that we've had in the past few weeks from the developer community we're talking to, but also what we've seen come through, you know, hearings, plan hearings in other cities, is that restricted discretionary with a non-notification clause does go a long way towards giving greater certainty. Yeah.
Oh, and just quickly to add is we have undertaken consultational pre-engagement with all the major developers at this point in time, and all of them have been supportive of our approach in terms of the scale of change that we're looking to achieve, the different rule frameworks that we're looking to deliver, and they're all supportive at that point. And then, as we've said, as we get into detailed provisions, we would look to start testing that with them to ensure that they have that certainty that we do have an enabling rule framework. But as Carl said, we need to ensure that, especially when we're going to medium density, that we do have quality outcomes, and that we do have the control we need to ensure that if you're reducing on-site amenity, that you're going to have some good quality on-site outcomes and protecting the existing environment and neighbourhood.
And I think on our report, it's all about balance, isn't it? And finding that right balance. Thank you, that's excellent.
If I could just add, and it is a very good question, but the success of the rule framework is not getting it made operative in the plan. It's the way, I guess, the culture we have within the organisation as we are working with developers, processing consents, ensuring we've got the right resources and the right skill sets in the right locations. And I think, you know, and you probably know this a wee bit, Carl, but, you know, Hamilton City, through their recent district plan review, went through and introduced this type of consenting framework, and went through quite a significant organisational change around resourcing and approach and how we work with developers to make it actually work. And they've managed to achieve that, and that's something and a journey that we're going to have to go on as well as Tauranga City Council.
Thank you. Councillor Morris, I think, and then we'll be ready for a resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of the developments within commercial zones, the places where people are habiting, in your professional opinion, would you give a view as to whether the consents issued have perhaps over time drifted away from the intent of the city plan provisions as set down by elected members past? Have the body of consents when it comes to commercial zones, have they drifted somewhat from what was perhaps originally intended by the elected members of the day?
I think there's probably a few issues there, and I think what has happened is that the intent of the commercial zone was that you'd have residential above ground floor. So things have moved a wee bit in that space in terms of some of the consents that have been granted. But also we've had quite a lot of industrial land that's been rezoned to commercial over time, but has still been very much industrial in nature. And now you're starting to see residential type developments popping up in those locations, like at Owens Place. And probably the zoning may not have kept account of the type of nature of some of those environments. So there's certainly some work to do around the commercial zone.
Right, thank you for that. Someone prepared to move? Councillor Robson, seconded Councillor Carrack.
Yes, speaking to the motion, could we just confirm standing orders that I have up to 10 minutes as long as I stay on topic, etc.? Thank you very much.
Who has 10 minutes, Councillor Robson? That's correct.
Yeah, you won't need to put the timer on. I won't take 10, I assure you. Look, I think this is just a really, really important area for us. The critical thing is balance here, and I suppose I'm concerned about how we, get clarity within our entire organisation about where the community wants that balance to be struck. I think a couple of questions sort of have alluded to that issue of getting the balance. Councillor Carrack, Councillor Morris. So I suppose in the next update I'm looking for a bit more reassurance. So I appreciate the update we've got. I am a little bit concerned about some of the comments that have been made. How we work with developers. I think at some point we have to realise that we do have the ability to say no to a developer. I'd like to see that sort of front and centre of everything, that this city is not run for the benefit of developers. Sometimes I think we do too much for them. But look, this is a good document, it's a good start. I think it's starting to highlight the complexity of this issue. I'm pleased that you've made the point that this is not a route to affordability. I know the Housing Affordability Forum is struggling, and I know amongst some social groups in the city there is some concern about the fact that they've been not been effective in actually having an impact in this area. And I'd hate to think that it becomes our responsibility via this process, almost by default. So clarity around these things is important. So thank you for what you've given us, but there is a lot more required. So I look forward to regular updates and more detail, particularly around the devilish stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carrack, do you wish to speak?
Only to say that I'm fairly comfortable with what I've heard so far in terms of the way forward, and I think we're learning from experience. When we entered this discussion with the community some years ago, and with that learning and the learning from other centres such as Auckland and other cities, I think we'll probably arrive at the right place that will enable some development, yet keep the communities, if directly affected, actually reasonably comfortable to actually accept that level of intensification.
Thank you. Councillor Morris next, then Mayor Brownless.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But again, likewise encouraged with the work that's going on and the discussion around certain types of development within different zones. I mean, I can offer my personal opinion that consents granted in former industrial / commercial zones have, in my view, gone beyond what the original intent of the people making the city plan decisions would have foreseen. And so that needs to be addressed by us, that needs to be pulled back over time by us, naturally subject to submissions and good decision making, but that does need to be pulled back. And we need to have a reset there in terms of the development that we are allowing in certain parts of our city, which in my view is inappropriate.
Then Councillor Brown, Councillor Mason.
Yes, I guess in order not to repeat problems that have encountered in the past, we do have to take the time, it's both ourselves and with the community, so that we take the community with us. I think that's a theme that that's come up in the last 6 months of council, the idea of taking people with us. So we've got to do that. One thing that's important to me is that to counter the criticism this will turn into a not such a nice place to live, that we've got to get that quality aspect right. And I'm just going to suggest that if you're in Auckland ever, perhaps travel to some of the places where they've had intensification for 10 years, because you might learn some of the good things that have happened, and you might learn some of the pitfalls, because there's both sides, and that would be a really nice balance. So should you happen to be in Auckland visiting friends or whatever, I suggest just have a look at that. That might just give some clues. When it comes to the parking, we've got to get that absolutely right first time, or what we will end up doing is having to provide parking on the street, which isn't ideal. So I'm all for looking at this seriously, but I'm also all for getting it right, so that we don't say, for example, oh, well, you only need one park per place, and then the next thing you're providing it on the street, in some cases narrower streets, and it just becomes a mess. So I just hope we can do the necessary study to get that right. And I don't know if people are going to be parking cars or even bubbles or shuttles or whatever in 10 years' time, but I've got a fair idea there'll be something needed. So it's good. But other than that, good to see the work progressing.
Thank you, Councillor Brown.
Thank you, I support this, and I think we're absolutely heading in the right direction. We've learned from the mistakes of the past, and looking at putting some good frameworks in place. We need to make sure we are always focused on the community and the community outcomes, as the Mayor has just said. For me particularly, grassroots engagement is absolutely critical. We need to be listening to our community all along the whole journey, not just at the start, in the middle, and the end, but the whole way through, because they'll tell us where their pain points are. And if you haven't visited the Auckland Design Manual website, aucklanddesignmanual.co.nz, it is a very impressive website with everything that you need, including making life easier for anyone that's building, for designers, for everybody. So yeah, hopefully we're going to head in that direction. It's a great piece of work. Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Yep, I will support this, and well done for the work to date. It does concern me, however, that there's less concern about affordability in this. I think that there is, as Councillor Robson said, seems to be the word developers being mentioned an awful lot. I don't think there's enough, from what we've heard today, sort of discussion, and I hope there's much more discussion with investors in terms of people that are renting. And I think there's two types of investors here. The social investors, and that's accessible properties, the social housing providers, etc. There's one group. The other group, I think that doesn't seem to have been mentioned as much as I said. For example, the Tauranga Property Investors Association. If you think of my understanding, is about a third of our properties in Tauranga are investment properties. It's 20,000 properties potentially. Those people are investors, and the model of investment in the past has been buy property. And if you're lucky, you can break even with the cost or the rent versus the cost, and the mortgage, and then you get a capital gain and you flick it on. That I believe is going to change as we go forward, as it has in other cities, where you're going to get much more apartment blocks, for example, being produced, 20, 30, 40 units, and this will be done by investors, and without the assumption that they're going to get a property gain, capital gain, and then flick it on. It's going to be long-term rentals. And now that would be an entirely separate, different type of building from, say, Latitude, the latest up here. That's got a whole lot of quality aspects to it. You might find one in future. This is just for rentals and not for property on. It could be cross-leasing, could be no property, no unit titles. My understanding is that it'll be a completely different sort of type of building. So I think that's something that we need to look at in the future, and where we're going with that. And so I think talking to people like the Tauranga Property Investors Association, what other cities have done, and I think there has also been a discussion here around quality, and quality is very important. Sometimes, quality comes at a price. We want people that are going to, we don't only have a housing supply crisis, we also have a housing affordability crisis. And sometimes having the ability for the less well-off to live in, a 3-bedroom apartment that can go for, $250, $300 a week, is actually what our community needs. And it's not up to us to say, we're imposing our quality sort of criteria on them. So I think these are some of the things that we should be considering going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart, then Councillor Clout.
Thank you. I think one of the things that is good, and it's mentioned in the agenda, is enabling greater housing choice through a greater variety of housing topologies and site sizes. And so for me, it's about people having a choice of what size they want and what, so you've got a mixture and you haven't just got all apartments, etc., or whatever, so there is choice. It's about balance, that was mentioned before, and just touching on affordability, it certainly doesn't tick that box, unfortunately, and I know Hobsonville have got a lot of intensification there, but most of the small homes there are around 700, 800 or even 900,000, so it's unfortunate it doesn't tick that box. And something we haven't talked about today, which is a very important part of the cost, is what goes under the ground, and there's a huge cost in infrastructure to develop intensification, especially when you're retrofitting areas, urban areas that already exist. So it's something hopefully we'll get some more information on. And lastly, the consultation with the wider community is absolutely vital, as has already been said. So taking people on the journey from the beginning and getting feedback as we go along is very important.
Thank you. Councillor Clout.
Yeah, I'd just like to commend staff on the work they've done to date, and bearing in mind that this all progresses towards our Tauranga urban strategy and also the future development strategy. So the work that you're doing is definitely in the right direction. I would just take issue with the mover who somehow implies that developers are sort of dastardly character. But just remember, it is the developers who are providing the much needed housing stock that our community wants. And it will come in a variety of typologies and price points, and that's very appropriate.
Thank you. I'll speak to it. I think we're pretty much in agreement. We want to find the balance in all of this, but of course that is the challenge, and it is why it takes so long. It's an enormous process to go through, so we have these regular updates so that we can keep having input along the way. But I think as Andy put out, Andy Mead said so well, that really it's not just about the plan, it's about our own culture, our organisation, the way we interpret the plan. The comments made about the apartments at the Mount indicate, that when you set the plan, then you have independent commissioners, you have no way of guaranteeing what will get approved and what won't. And so the plan does have to be very well thought through and processed with the community so that we can hopefully find the balance we want. At some point we'll have a discussion about the urban design panel idea. It is a way of providing some balance whereby you can have that independent assessment, giving guidance and also having statutory powers there as well. Be a debate or a discussion for another day, but it is going to come that where we're going to have a look at that and see how it works in other cities, I think. Important point made too about this whole process is not focused on getting affordable housing. That's got many other factors that contribute to it. Obviously, when we remove red tape and unnecessary regulation and costs, we can help with some of that, but it's really not the focus. And the comms review, which everyone's aware is underway in our organisation. You know, we know that this is a huge communication strategy. We must engage with the community well if we're to get through the process, particularly the TUS, Tauranga Urban Strategy, and the intensification on the Te Papa Peninsula, the spatial plan that we'll be working through there. So I think we can be confident the message is about communication appropriately and on a wide scale is being taken on board by the organisation. Right a reply, or any other speakers? Right a reply, Councillor Robson.
Thank you, Chair. Look, right a reply is effectively to respond to some of the remarks made in response to the movers speaking, and there were a few things made. The Chair himself made the comment about, well, it takes so long, and in that regard, I'd rather get this right than do it quickly. Looking at the time frame you're talking about, I'm a little bit concerned, so I'm looking for reassurance of that down the line. People talked a lot about community engagement. I think with community engagement, the critical thing is the pre-engagement. Our comms head has talked to us about this previously, but it's very hard to engage with the community when they're not properly informed. So you ask someone their opinion on something, but if you've withheld information, or you haven't given them information, or the information you've given them is partial, that's not proper community engagement. So you've really got to make sure people are properly informed. On the affordability issue, look, we just got to stop this canard. You know, affordable housing will not be delivered by the market. It certainly won't be delivered by developers. I mean, these people are driven by making a dollar. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make them evil. But let's be clear about it. Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, basically said when you get a couple of those buggers together, no good comes of it. Right? That's in The Wealth of Nations, written by most people's capitalist god, Adam Smith. So our job is to make sure we get the balance right. In a civilized country, right, affordable housing, social housing would be provided via progressive taxation, courtesy of the state. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we're players in that space, right? In a civilized country. The question to us, and the question we should be asking of central government as elected members, representatives of all our community, is are you a civilized government? Do you want to create a civilized country? Look, this is good work, but the point I want to reiterate is it's extraordinarily complex. It is difficult to get the balance right. With regard to an urban design panel, I would like to see appointed to an urban design panel people who have effectively executed this balance in the real world in a city that's comparable to ours. My big concern is it comes back to a comment made earlier by staff about how the house faces the street, which is Corbusier, and anyone with any design knowledge whatsoever would know facing the street is daft. What you should be doing is facing the sun, right? Because that's a free energy source. That's how I design my house. I don't have heating. I don't need it in Tauranga. So there's a lot of things in our culture, there's a lot of things in our economic setup, there's a lot of things in our politics that are bearing on this. It's an enormously difficult task staff face. I wish you all the luck in the world, and if you need more resource, come back early, come back often. Yeah, this is critical for this city.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? It's carried unanimously. We'll move on to DC 101. I hope we could just, if necessary, have a very short break, but I was going to hold the coffee break because we need to try and get through 2 more items at least before lunch if we can. So if we could just, if we do need to have a quick break, please don't leave the room unless it's for that purpose, and then we'll try and get through DC 101 at least and then take a coffee break. you. Elected members, could we, Kelton Clout, could you ask the members in the lounge to come back? We'll reconvene, please. Okay, we shall recommence. We will look at DC 101, Urban Form and Transport Initiative. Andy and Doug Spittle here. Over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We've just got a quick presentation that Doug will run through, but just as a brief introduction, this is an update on progress for the Urban Form and Transport Initiative. Some, I guess, key milestones and have been made in the last sort of few weeks that are worth updating on. It has been through Smart Growth just recently, so I'll just hand it over to Doug and the presentation.
Thank you, Morena. So I'll just flick to the first slide, but just really quickly to remind you, the UFTI, or UFTI, is the Urban Form Transport Initiative, and it's at a sub-regional level looking to align our long-term urban development planning and transport investment planning with the government policy statement on land transport, and also its emerging urban growth agenda, and get complete alignment with how we are doing it with government so that there's a clear platform for partnership and investment, and in particular support our short-term needs in the face of an emerging serious issue around capacity for further development in the face of growth. So phase 1 has been completed. That has produced a draft project plan and has also established the pathway forward to complete this whole process essentially in a calendar year. An important milestone is making appointments for the project leads, so that's a project director, a project manager, and a technical transport advisor. The names of the people that have been appointed are up there. They have been introduced to the Smart Growth Leadership Committee on the 17th of April, and some of you would have been present there. Robert and Janine in particular have had a long history working with the Transport Agency in very senior roles in the planning and investment space, and so they're very familiar with the processes and the culture around the NZTA as well as the issues on the ground. And Ben Pesey's had about 15 years of experience and is based in Wellington, but has worked nationally on creating business cases, so they're very well qualified and suited to the task. Phase 2 has now commenced, so that is going to involve onboarding these new appointments, getting them here, getting them resourced, getting them connected to the key staff and the partner councils that will be assisting them through the process. They will finalise the draft project plan, make it their own, make sure they're comfortable that it's deliverable, and then also complete a foundation report, which is similar to what ATAP did in Auckland, just creating the context for what the problem is we're trying to solve, be very clear on that, and how options will be evaluated in future stages. In terms of project funding and timing, the NZTA will fund 43% of the project costs. The remainder will be met by the Smart Growth partners. An indicative time frame for completing the remaining 5 phases, so that's phases 2 through to 6, is by the end of the calendar year, but I will say there's license for the team that have come in, the appointments, to refresh the project plan, and then that will confirm what time frames are actually expected. Obviously, the lens of being very politically savvy and looking towards an election next year looms large, so I'm sure they'll be cognizant they need to deliver on that. Just on this update as well, just highlight that there's a visit from Minister Phil Twyford on the 15th of May. That's an important occasion, as being the Minister of Housing and Urban Development and the Minister of Transport. He hits all our kind of number one issues at the moment. He'll be meeting with mayors, the Independent Smart Growth Chair, senior council staff, the Port of Tauranga Chief Executive, and also representatives from the development community. Focus of a 2-hour meeting on that day will be on the development capacity issues and the transport infrastructure. We need to support that, so that's very important. We're preparing material to make those issues very clear and the proposed solutions very clear to the Minister, and that includes actually on the basis of a prompting from the development community at the last meeting of this committee, just how imminent the shortfall of housing capacity is for the city, and there will be an independent review testing those claims, verifying just how imminent that shortfall is, that will be available for that meeting with the Minister, and that's currently being prepared by Veros Property Services. Yeah, so very quick update. That's where the project's at.
Thank you. So, any questions? Councillor Brown.
Thank you. The independent review that you just talked about is going to be ready for the visit on the 15th of May, but we're not going to get it till the 11th of June. So why the time delay? Why can we not see it?
If I could just talk to that. So we were initially hoping to bring it to this meeting, but I guess there was some thought that it's probably better to spend a little bit more time completing the report and having that discussion with the Minister before having something come out publicly, and perhaps backing the Minister into a corner. We're quite happy when the report is complete that we can circulate it to elected members prior to the 15th, but in terms of bringing it to a formal committee meeting, that will be after the Minister's visit.
Councillor Robson was next. Okay. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in terms of the near-term projects, what are we determining as near-term? Because I'm concerned that Papamoa East Interchange, which has already been brought forward, is not on this radar, and we know how critical it is for the growth of Te Tumu. So what is considered near-term projects, and where does the PEI sit?
That's a good question. So those near-term projects were the projects that were defined as being uncertain, but needed effectively now to enable growth, particularly the projects around the upgrades of State Highway 29 for Te Ariko and the Tauranga Northern Link, and upgrades of State Highway 2 North for Omokaroa. Also that broader area around Hewletts Road and Tosha Street in terms of the interface between the port and I guess the city's traffic is critical. The Papamoa East Interchange was not on that list because it has I guess worked through a separate process through the Housing Infrastructure Fund with agreement there around funding, so that's more a matter of us trying to resolve the challenges of bringing Te Tumu to market to get that project moving, but not one where we think there's any issues around funding or delivery.
Councillor Malloy, then Councillor Stewart, then Robson.
Yeah, through the chair, I see here that NZTO picking up 43%. How's the rest of the cost allocated?
Yeah, so NZTA's shares are still subject to a variation process to the Regional Land Transport Fund, but once that's complete, that will be there. The remaining funds, I understand, are Tauranga City and the Regional Council are picking up 40% of that cost, and Western Bay 20%. So we have 40% of 57%, if you can do the maths there. Yep.
Councillor Robson.
It's just really the summary of issues on DC 101, the very last one, and it's just the way it's framed, and I'm wondering whether it should be framed as sorting out the impact of Port of Tauranga operations on the transport systems of the City of Tauranga. It seems to me here that the Port of Tauranga is, once again we're looking to facilitate, the objective, the outcome is facilitating the operations of the Port of Tauranga. This is a port that makes no contribution in some ways, certainly to the City Council, other than by paying rates, but a massive impost in terms of the transport requirements that it imposes on our systems. It also, for that matter, makes no contribution to the cruise situation, even though I'm sure it takes money from the cruise boats for parking there. This port seems to get a bit of a free run. The way this is phrased seems to continue that mindset. Is it possible to rewrite that, or is that fixed in stone?
If I just quickly comment on that through the chair, probably won't rewrite the report, but the issue of addressing that Hewletts Road area to give access to the port, the scope of that is looking at huge growth that's happening in the eastern Bay of Plenty, particularly with projects supported by the Provincial Growth Fund out that way. What the solution is in terms of changes on the ground, and then how the funding and financing comes in to fix that, that's the scope open to the project. And so I think the issue that is raised by Councillor Robson, like, is it fair who pays, and what's the imposition on, say, councils? Stating that the issue is paramount to address, that we continue to have an efficient access to the port for the case of New Zealand Inc. Isn't to say that the solution has to rest on the shoulders of council. So I think if that,
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Similar to Councillor Robson, only quite different. With regards to the Urban Form and Transport Initiative principles, have they already been signed or agreed to?
Yes, there's a series of, through the chair, there's a series of principles in terms of how the project will operate and how the partnership will operate, as well as indication of the objectives that the project is looking to achieve. Those are confirmed in draft, but the second phase, this creation of a foundation report, will give an opportunity for confirming that, I'd leave that to the appointments that have been made to determine how that would come through. Reporting through governance and such for confirmation.
So if I could just raise my concern, it's to do with clause 2(9), and at the moment it states acknowledge sensitivities and release information publicly only when agreed, and I'd prefer that to be turned around on its head. So it's release information publicly, and then if there's good reason to withhold any information, so turn it around on its head rather than the way it's.
Okay, I think the clause was not around providing as little information as possible to the public. It was more around the idea that we should agree our communications collectively about what we're going to communicate and how we're going to communicate that, what the message is, so that you don't have one organisation like the City Council going and saying things that are inconsistent with the message that the other partners to the project want to convey.
Is it possible to make a suggestion that it could be reworded?
We could take that back to the team.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I'll be happy to move receipt of it. Councillor Brown, second. So we are in this process with the UFTI initiative, and this committee, of course, is formed to help support this going through our partners, but recognising the important role TCC plays in this, given that so much of this is within our boundaries. But we have to approach it, and we should approach it from a Western Bay perspective with our smart growth partners. But we do need to keep in mind, I think, that this is to develop a transport plan that is in line with our urban form development, our land development, and it's not just simply something to lobby government to get some things done in the short term. This is going to be a process that hopefully in a year, if I'm optimistic, will deliver something that is in place for our city that will last the next 15 or 20 years at least. We had a plan like this in 2004, and we thought we were on top of our transport needs around the city, and we know that we have fallen behind in that. I think no one's more frustrated than I am that we can't just immediately start building a few roads that are pretty obvious around the place. But we must have an integrated transport system. We must pursue modal shift. But we do have to, with the port here, we do have to build some pretty important accesses to it, and the rail has to be considered as well. We need a long-term view at how we address the increasing rail traffic to the port and from the port. So it's good to get the update today. It's good to see the appointments that have been made. and we move on to the next phase. We hope, with the visit of the Minister in May, that we will get some response from the government and recognising the importance of the port being here in our city and how that puts pressure on our roading infrastructure, and the importance of particular roads, that LA29 and the TNL out to State Highway 2, are important for the delivery of housing, which is critical for the city. Those are the two sort of short-term, real emergency issues, but it's much bigger than that. The UFTI is going to be looking at a real plan comprehensively across our city and across the Western Bay. So I'm pleased to receive the report today. Oh, sorry. Just and then Councillor.
Thank you. We all know that transport and housing are our biggest issues, and so this is bringing that all together. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, and this is planning. This is multi-agency planning with NZTA, Kiwi Rail, Port of Tauranga, Smart Growth, and all the other partners. Recently, we had a meeting with Clayton Mitchell, and we talked to him about the meeting coming up with Minister Twyford, and it was his advice to give the Minister a clear, simple document about what the problem is and how to fix it. Great, he's going to get the report, but his advice was keep it really simple, what the problem is and what we need to fix it. So hopefully we can do that. So, because he said they get bombarded with reports for Africa, keep it simple was his message.
Thank you, Councillor Robson.
When I look at the list of players in the development of the strategic plan and their record on successful strategic planning, I'm minded of the old aphorism of nailing bricks together and expecting it to float. Look, the Minister of Tauranga, Phil Twyford, needs to get a clear message. I believe that's true. And in the spirit of Toyota's A3, we could put it on one side of a sheet of paper. The reality is we can do all the planning we like, but unless there is funding from some sort, and funding, not financing, funding from some source. I've heard it said, and I would not disagree with it, that our roading system is $2 billion short, right, of getting into a fit-for-purpose situation. $2 billion. And in that context, this sort of meeting is critical. But the Minister of Tauranga needs to take away a very clear message that no matter how much planning we do in this city and how good that planning is, even against the odds, right, without funding, we're dead. Right? There will be no housing, there will be no decent transport system without funding. And sure as hell, the ratepayers of Tauranga are in no position to pick up this bill, which has been created in effect by central government policy. $2 billion. Yeah?
Yep, that's a great message, and it's consistent with what I've already mentioned to the Minister in the past. That crucial link between transport infrastructure and the ability to provide more houses. We've heard about the desperate need for more houses here. So I think we can only put that on the table, and I believe and hope that that will be a sufficient incentive, together with the fact that we do home to the largest port in New Zealand, probably the most efficient port as well, will be enough to create action. It is disappointing because in a way I know the problem and I know the solutions. But we've got to play the game in a sense, and we've got to do the studies and get that done officially and present that to the Minister. But yeah, most of us now could recite what the problem is, and we also have a fairly good idea of the solution, and that's to get on, do the Northern Arterial, do Tauriko, do Hewlett's Road, and get the Papamoa East link into place. There's your solution. But the funding, as Councillor Robson has indicated, is a critical part of that, and only the government can provide that. We're prepared to pay for what's our responsibility. What we're not prepared to pay for is what central government, through money that they get from petrol and other taxes, is properly tasked to do. So I'm looking forward to the meeting, and hopefully we can go in a good spirit and get some actual agreement out of it. Thanks.
Any other speakers? Councillor Malloy.
Just very briefly, I will support, but I have said before, You know, we've got a very unhappy community out there now with regard to transport. It takes probably at least 5 years from the time you push the green button for anything to be produced. So in 5 years' time, if you think that the community's unhappy now, you wait for another 5 years, and you know, very little is going to happen inside of that 5 years. So we really do need to get something on the road.
Thank you. Right, a reply. I think Councillor Robson raises the issue of funding very appropriately. I think he might be a little bit light on his costing. I think we have heard 4 billion. And if you think about a transport plan that really does address the level crossings of the railways, the resilience issues of the Kaimai Tunnel, the railway, the port, New Zealand Inc. would be in deep trouble if an earthquake caused any disruption to that rail line through to Auckland. It's huge money in this area, and the completion of the ring road, which I've gone on about for some time, grade separating State Highway 29 all the way through to Bay Fair, is essential for people to have transport options and so on. We raised it last year, as you remember. I made a submission to, and TCC made a submission that we all supported to the Regional Council, led by Deputy Mayor Councillor Clout. But we were advised we need to get the plan first. We need to come up with this. This is why we're on this journey. But it is true. I agree entirely with Councillor Robson that once we have the plan, we are going to then seriously have to look at the funding, and I do not believe the central government will ever provide all that funding. Auckland is continuing to just suck so much money into their transport needs. The $1 billion blowout we just heard about with the inner city rail project, and the modal shift, the increased fare rate across the country has just taken so much money out of the National Land Transport Fund that we will have to ask our ratepayers to make a contribution, but we won't be doing that without a significant contribution from the Regional Council, who receive, as we all know, the dividends from the Port of Tauranga. It will have to be a collaborative approach. But if we can come up with our bit, we can then, I think, go to central government and get a reasonable contribution from them. It irks me that we have this regional growth fund of $3 billion, and that sort of money ought to be taken care of. The most important thing in this country is our export port right here, and making sure it remains efficient. So that conversation will come in the future, Councillor Robson, and we'll be all singing from the same song sheet, I believe. But happy to receive this report today and to continue to work hard, and thank our staff for how hard they work in cooperation and collaboration with our partners in Smart Growth to get this project delivered. I'll put the motion to receive the report. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? It's carried. Thank you very much. Now I'll be remiss if I don't allow some of us some coffee. So we will take a 10-minute adjournment. I'm sorry to be tight on time today, but we do have still another presentation before we move on to the ABLE reports, which I know elected members will want to spend some time analysing and discussing. There are two, the Farm Street report as well as the CBD report. So if we can try and make it 10 minutes for a coffee break, please, and then return, we'll call you back. YouTube filming. Thank you. Thank you, members. We will reconvene. And as mentioned earlier, we will have a change in the schedule. We'll now go to DC 114, which is the report on natural hazards and resilience planning. Elected members will remember, hopefully, that we had this in a briefing Campbell presented to us. It is a very important amount of information because of its impact upon ratepayers in the city. Yesterday, information was being released on flooding, on erosion, coastal erosion. So there are 30-something slides. We are not going to have questions going through. We're going to ask Campbell to take us through as succinctly as he can, but we don't want to, not do what needs to be done here. This is the first time the public get to see this, and it will have an impact upon many of them. So we will do that, go through it, then questions at the end. Mayor Brownless.
It's just occurred to me that my late mother's property and my own are probably affected by this. Therefore, I think I should declare a conflict of interest and not take part in discussion or decision making on that. If
That's entirely your decision, but we are only receiving a report. There's no decisions being made, so I can't see why you couldn't still remain.
Well, I
but
suppose
it is entirely
it's a public
your decision.
session, all right. Well, I'll listen, but I don't want to partake.
Yep, that's fine. All right, so we'll hand over to Campbell, and if he could introduce his colleague there too. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time. On my left is Steve Rayner. Steve is the Council's Resilience Specialist.
Could I ask you just to pull it forward? Yeah, thank you.
My apologies, I just didn't want a microphone in my face. Steve Rayner is our Resilience Specialist. Steve started with us approximately October last year. You will recall that you have set in place the beginnings of a resilience strategy and funded that through the LTP. We're going to today cover a background to your wider natural hazards planning project to put what is happening from yesterday in context. We're going to discuss and present on the resilience project, and then I'm going to conclude on a range of matters to deal with sea level rise and the release of information on inner harbour erosion. You've all been made aware of the release of that information and the impacts that has. I'm going to start my conversation off not looking at slides and make it quite clear I'm not a climate scientist, nor is Steve. I'm not here to probably debate whether climate change is happening or sea level rise is happening. The key things that are in front of us are around managing the legislative requirements, the guidance that is in front of us, and also the progression of our work programs to deliver housing. They are all dependent on understanding sea level rise, the range of sea level rise scenarios, and the impact that it has upon our natural hazards. Okay. So I'm going to start probably on our journey of approximately around 20 plus years ago. The Council's actually been preparing for the impacts of sea level rise through natural hazard management since then, and if not before. She started back in the 80s. The focus heavily was on coastal erosion through a project called Coastal Dune Watch, and it led into the creation of erosion zones along our entire inner harbour coast that are managed through the city plan. Following after that, we started storm surge planning, and in 2003 we also did some high-level work on mapping liquefaction. That didn't include the impact on sea level rise, but it was about mapping the hazard zones. Okay, this is not new stuff for us, nor is the conversation around sea level rise. Back in 2008-09, as we did the city plan, we updated all of our information in the city plan, and we improved our rule frameworks around consideration of management treat along our open coast, and also improved our understanding on the levels that we would need to build to around our inner harbour margins from inundation. The key thing from this time to where we are today is that there has been changes in the predictions on sea level rise. They only go up. And there is now, as released last year, the Ministry for the Environment's, in 2008, the Ministry for the Environment's climate guidance and how we apply that within our natural hazards planning. Okay, You'll also remember back in 2005, 2009, 2013, we were all, for those who were here back in that time, we did a significant project on intense rainfall events. We developed our wider response in terms of building infrastructure, which took the city's debt for stormwater to about approximately $100 million. And then we created the Integrated Stormwater Project. And off that, we did, for the 5 years preceding that, a significant amount of public information release of flood maps on people's property type files and on our land information memorandum. And you're now running that Plan Change 27 to give effect to the last part of that after setting your level of service, which is the regulatory control. Okay, that will has, as we discussed in our last briefing on that project, the consideration of sea level rise as a key component in the factoring and determining the impacts of flooding. 2012 to 17, you're heavily involved in Tsunami Survive. That was the release of flood maps, the consideration of sirens, evacuation planning routes. All of that information went out to the public. All of that information is sitting on property files and goes on LIMS. And we also, around 2015, did a first cut of high-level erosion considerations around key components where we were having instability around the inner harbour margins, Mātua, Mongatapu, Matapi, and we mapped those and determined high risk, and we did that jointly with the Regional Council and with Western Bay. And Western Bay specifically used that work to determine the potential cost loss of erosion and therefore where they should pitch themselves in terms of the development of a coastal structures policy and funding within their LTP. I also, on the 5th of Jan last year, remember there was a significant storm surge event. It's been determined that it's a 30-year return period storm surge event where we had overtopping of our landform within the inner harbour margins. While it didn't create widespread damage, you'll all remember that. You'll have seen YouTube clips or video imaging of that. When we are talking into the future around reproducing our inner harbour inundation zones, which will happen later this year, we use that as a validation event, and then we up the storms and consider the sea level rise, okay? We are living at some risk, and there is uncertainty around sea level rise. So there is a lot going on in the space, and there is a lot that has been happening in the last few years. And while we maybe feel that we're in a quiet period and I haven't turned up a lot to talk to you about this issue, it is because we have been doing a good couple of years study on extreme storm surge and sea level rise, and we've been doing a lot of work on mapping, and it's been actually taking us the last 2.5 years to get to where we are today. So while we may think we're in a space of silence, we're actually in a space of a significant amount of work jointly being worked through between the 3 councils. Okay, we've also talked about that other list that's in front of us. We're doing a significant amount of planning work for our greenfield growth areas, specifically Te Timu and Tauriko West, where in these growth areas we are considering sea level rise up to 1.6 metres, that being a figure that is expected to be achieved under a range of certainties and uncertainties, but is required under MFE guidance for new greenfield areas. Okay, we're also doing a lot of work around liquefaction, open coast storm surge. So we are in the space of a lot of research that is translating into a new urban form and then has potential impacts upon our community. We also, through your direction, have initiated our resilience project, which is why Steve's here today, because he will give you a rundown in a few slides of what that is. The key thing around why we need to focus on our natural hazards is that if we are going to go anywhere with any planning for a compact city, for the intensification and the plan changes that you've talked about today and all the other ones, we actually need to get a handle on it. We cannot comply with the requirements of a regional policy statement unless we have considered the risk of these and how we're going to reduce risk over time. It's a must comply with requirement, and there are triggers within the regional policy statement. We will not be able to deal with the implementation of the urban strategy or these plan changes without dealing with it as a high level in the first instance and then stepping it through to a more specific detailed level as we've been doing with the erosion and inundation work that we're going to talk about later on today. We also cannot deliver on any new community project like Te Timu Tauriko West without delivering what's called a low level of risk. Some of you remember when the regional policy statement was being developed, this was called an acceptable level of risk. That means we actually have to drive resilience within our growth areas of the landform, the built form, the social infrastructure, and all of our built infrastructure with service at the community. They need to be resilient to all shock and slow creep events. Slow creep is like sea level rise, a shock event is an earthquake resulting in liquefaction. Okay? And then there is a range of requirements. We'll talk about some of these later on, but generally speaking, actual hazard planning is governed under the 4 main acts that you operate under: the Building Act, Resource Management Act, Civil Defence Emergency Management Act, and the LGR, and you've got functions of this under all of those. As soon as we hold information, we share it, and we utilise it in building a more resilient community. That's the good news story of why we do this work. We're not here to be callous. We're not here to have our mayor receive letters because he's a property owner. We're here to share that information that allows for everyone to understand the potential, and in the space of sea level rise that we'll get into later on, there is uncertainty around that. So we're going to start just off that background with Steve giving us an overview of the Risk and Resilience Project.
Thank you. Next one. So that's a graphic you've seen before, risk and resilience. We're looking at the project specifically for this city. So if you think of resilience, there are a number of aspects that are affected by that, but our project is looking at the infrastructure and the urban form. So that's what we've started with that. That's the best bang for buck and underlies so many of the other components. Next one. Oh, I'm doing this here. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. Cam's not my slave after all. So just looking in the context, it's not just a Tauranga issue. We are blessed with lots of natural hazards here, but New Zealand-wide, it's come to the fore. There's the Christchurch earthquakes, the Kaikoura earthquakes, there's been floods, and just a number of things happening throughout New Zealand and globally, which means that resilience has become a topic of discussion for governments and scientists and engineers around the world. And we're having a great time. But Tauranga actually has a lot of challenges. So that's where we're at in trying to make Tauranga more resilient to the shocks and events that we need to think of. So our challenge is, what for Tauranga does our resilience look like? What is our resilient city, and what implications or what changes might that mean in terms of our city growth, the way we run our infrastructure and where we put the new infrastructure? Things like that needed to be just discussed and considered and studied through this resilience project. So one of the things, the slides that were up this morning, we were talking about the compact city and more intensification, and the sorts of things that are discussed there always cross over with the resilience type of components. So when we're considering a compact city, we don't want to put that compact area in a place that has more hazards or potentially more hazards that we'd need to engineer around. So those discussions always happen together. So how is that going to work, and how are we going to choose between projects that we come up with as part of this project? So that's our challenge in Tauranga. So right now, the key hazard or key focus area for us is the studies behind the understanding of our hazards. Things that have been studied before but now are updating are, for example, the liquefaction. We have an excellent liquefaction map of the city. It's from 2003, so there's a lot of change to the science. Thanks to Christchurch, who gave us a sort of a laboratory right in our back doorstep. We also now have at least 2,000 tests, soil tests around the city that can now better inform that study. So the liquefaction study is happening right at the moment, understanding what happens to our city when we get a shake, what the ground does, and what damage it's likely to do to our buildings. So that's how we're going about that one, but it's just understanding the hazards. Other ones that we're looking at are perhaps volcanic ashfall. We're looking at erosion, flooding from the inland, flooding from the sea, and coastal erosion. So all of these things kind of converge on our city, and underlying a lot of them, or making them a little worse, is the long-term effects of sea level rise. So at the moment we're understanding those. A lot of studies happening at the moment in that space, and then we're working on the consequence of that. So we have assets. How vulnerable are they to each of those events? And of course it depends on how bad it is. But we're just looking at how exposed they are, how vulnerable they are. And then the third part of our study was, okay, what are we going to do about it? We need to figure a response. Are we going to strengthen things? Are we going to move things away from the hazard zones? It's great when we're talking in terms of the urban form, because we'll know the hazards before we do put our form in place, and so we can do the avoiding of those instead of having to worry about what we're going to do later. So those are the key areas: understand our risk, their consequences, and then our response. And that really, in a nutshell, is the Resilience Project. It's a 3-year project, so we're probably coming to the end of the first year, so 2 more years on that one. Thank you, Cam.
Okay, so just before I do this, I just want to mention just about the intensification plan changes that you've just discussed. One of the key things that we have to do as part of that, as directed by the Regional Council, is comply with the Regional Policy Statement, because we are providing for density greater than 5 hectares, as I alluded to before. That's requiring us to go through a full citywide risk assessment of all hazards. That's quite a it's quite a difficult challenge. The main thing being is that the information we have is sporadic and sparse, and some of it is brand new and some of it is old. So we're doing our best to work through that risk assessment with the Regional Council to see how best we can comply with that with the information we know, and then work through where the gaps are. So that information is quite dependent upon how that plan change will roll out. And obviously, as we go through some of these further slides, just keep that in mind in terms of the issues around trying to deliver compact city, and what Steve just said, because we're trying to keep people out of harm's way long term. And also, maybe just sitting and being a bit council centric here, this is also about managing long-term liability. We have information, we have research projects in which to understand these risks. We have to share this information and manage that information appropriately, because we still have not truly understood who is going to pay for the long-term effects of hazards. We're just quite certain it's not going to be the banks or the insurance companies. Okay, so just keep that in mind when we are trying to balance this conversation around our community and our affected parties, and what is the role of council under that legislation and long-term liability. Okay, so just re-preempting this, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm actually not here to sell you sea level rise, guys. The reality is there's enough body of information around here, enough documents, enough decisions that have been made, including the Climate Change Declaration, around this space. Okay? There is a raft of policy documents and a raft of local and international ones that are clearly directing us that sea level rise is real, climate change is real. And our job is to, in this conversation, discuss the adaptation component. How are we going to adapt? I'm not in the space of conversing with you about the mitigation being the CO2 or anything. So that's why I'm not going to have a conversation around your individual or personal feelings around sea level rise and climate change. I'm just trying to overstep that, if I might. We can have that quietly, a conversation after the fact. There's enough going on in the space. We know where we sit. Okay. The key thing that is taking us forward is that this document, which was produced by MFE, first cut was in 2008, and if you remember, maybe back 10, 15 years ago, we were probably dealing with 2050 sort of scenarios, about 0.5 metres, 2100 plus was 1 metre. Okay. The MFE guidance on coastal hazards shifted into what they called an adaptive planning process. It was essentially saying, while sea level rise is known and will occur, there is a range of uncertainties around what sea level rise scenario will get to and what time horizon that will be reached, and therefore that has an impact upon what those effects are. What it required us to do is consider a minimum of 4 values and then apply differing values dependent upon the nature of the development. I.e., as an example, a new greenfield area, that guidance document requires us to plan for 1.6 metres over the next 100 years. In terms of intensification, like the risk assessment we've just talked about to comply with the regional policy statement, this document actually suggests we need to use 4 scenarios, and if we can't choose 4, we've got to choose a minimum of 1 metre. The regional policy statement, which is our regional council's regional policy statement that we must give effect for all plan changes, has a policy on sea level rise that translates into 1.25 metres of sea level rise that we have to consider over the next 100 years. So we've got a vast array of scenarios and guidance documents. We've got minimum standards we have to achieve. And so when you're thinking about it from a planning perspective, not having one value, the idea of certainty is difficult to deal with. So we've got to just keep our mind in this broad range that there is uncertainty, not of sea level rise, but it's actually the time horizon of when different sea level rise scenarios will be received. Okay, so the key thing is the sea rising. The answer is yes. Our sea has been rising. It's been rising for the last wee while at between 1.9 to 2.1 millimetres per year. That's a real small number, and essentially says, why would you be worried about it? It's the fact that that is expected to continue. And when you exacerbate that number over a long period of time of say 100 years, and you put the 2018 January storm surge event onto that, we then have a problem. Okay, that's the thing we have to be thinking about. This isn't a today problem, but there are today hazard issues. This is the long-term process of how we're going to share this information and then respond to that with our community. Okay, we have been monitoring sea level since the 70s. Okay, and we have been experiencing this change. Okay, and we will continue to monitor it. We actually have tug berth stations around our inner harbour margin, and over time we'll probably shift from that into actually having probably more specific GPS LiDAR settings, which we allow us to actually do continuing monitoring. Okay. So the key issue out of the International Plan for Climate Change is that there are essentially there's a range of scenarios, and they are based upon greenhouse gas emissions. They are called RCPs. The reality is that RC 2.6 is becoming the increasingly unlikely one. That was the one which the world would progress forward with low carbon emission. Okay, it's increasingly unlikely. RCP 4.5, what was called the mid-range scenario, which is where everyone adhered to the Paris Accord essentially and started to, over time, reduce carbon emissions. And day by day, that becomes unlikely as well, unless the world is responding through a mitigation process. RCP 8.5 is a business as usual scenario with a continued high emission. And the work we are doing, we've added in another scenario above that, which we call the H+, which is dealing with the issues of deep uncertainty, but the what if, and we need to know what we might call that worst case scenario. In a recent report from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, it was made clear in that 1 metre of sea level rise over the next 100 years is locked in. Pretty much no matter what the world's going to do, we're dealing with a metre of sea level rise. So we've got to focus upon that broad range, but remember these statements and this business as usual process. What does that look like? Well, here's a fancy graph covering RCP 2.6 to the H+. And what that essentially gives us is by a 2130 period, and why I use 2130 is that's 110 years from now, and we're required to plan for 100 years. So we put 10 years onto it because we review it every 10 years, so we're always 10 years ahead of the game. 2130, that broad range is sitting from around half a metre, which would be if the world pared back its carbon emissions, to a higher order scenario which we have to plan for greenfield areas of 1.6 metres. Okay, that's the range we deal with. They are all the scenarios we deal with, and imagine me trying to have a conversation with the community about that when we're producing erosion data, when we actually have to work in that force field. One of the key things is there's not that much difference between RCP 6.0 and 4.5, so often in our work we're going to start combining those scenarios together. Okay, so we're working essentially with 4. So there are a range of possible consequences of a rising sea. Damage to homes and properties, loss of land values. There's an increasing risk, and there's an increasing exponential risk over the range of those sea level rise scenarios. And this isn't just on our coast. This is in regard to a rising groundwater table, and that risk of liquefaction and earthquake shaking event exponentially increases because the groundwater table is higher. Okay, this affects all of our hazards. There's long-term abandonment of property, as we have seen in some places around New Zealand, and the reality is you are going to be asked to intervene. Our starting point is probably no dissimilar to how you've managed flood from intense rainfall events. We've created the Reactive Reserve Fund, but in time, that scale of that is probably going to be too great. So we've got to be quite aware of this long-term, and clearly there are social and community issues that come from this. Okay, it's a long-term change. It's going to affect our urban form, and we need to be working through this resilience project to be able to place ourselves appropriately within the context of these hazards. So the specific work that is underway, that is work that is underway right now, not the work that we've come from, there is erosion, and that is the retreat of our shorelines, our beaches and our cliffs, caused by waves and ocean currents. The specific work that was released to our community yesterday was inner harbour erosion, which largely deals with two issues of the cliff face or the low-lying areas. In terms of the cliff face, that is a direct loss of land. It doesn't come back like on the open coast through summer or winter periods. And if you need examples of that, I'm happy to show you, but a clear example, if you go up to our Cameron Road offices and you look over the road to Mongatapu, or you drive down 15th Avenue to Mongatapu, you can see the current day erosion. Okay? And all the world wants to do is fit itself within an equilibrium. Okay? So if that equilibrium changes of an angle of repose and the sea goes up, this wants to do this. Okay? And we've got people in that place. We've got harbour inundation. That is a remodelling of our harbour. We've rebuilt a model with NIWA of exactly how our harbour operates, and we've used the 2018 storm as the validation event, and then we run the sea level rise scenarios. We're working on monitoring the groundwater table. We've been doing this over the last 15 years, but we've actually brought in new technology that allows us to monitor the groundwater table every 15 minutes. We extract all that data, and the reason why that's really important is once upon a time we dipped those, so we went to those monitoring stations, dipped in a little stone with a cord on it pretty much, and said where does that lie. Now we can actually track that in real time to what the sea is doing off our tugberth stations to barometric pressure, and we can actually start to translate that long term into how will that potentially rise with sea level rise. And Steve is doing work, and I'm currently about to head out for tender for a range of work on liquefaction. That's the loss of soil strength, and we all saw that in Christchurch, and that is clearly a risk for us along our open coast. This is core work that is underway that feeds into all of your plan work and all of your infrastructure planning work. Timelines are, erosion was released yesterday. We'll talk about what that specific release was. Flooding ascents and safety maps and Plan Change 27 is meant to go out in mid-2019, and we've talked about that in a recent briefing. Harbour inundation and groundwater is likely to come out before your election cycle. We're just dealing with the last tidy up for that work, and while we would prefer to send this data out as one package of erosion and inundation, because it is the same community members, it is better to get this out today so we're not sitting on it. Otherwise we're sitting on this data too long, and I'm quite conscious of ensuring that we're sharing this information appropriately with our community. While we've got our liquefaction lateral spread underway, by the time we work through all of that data and all that process and the modelling and the methodology, we're going to be sitting at around a 2020 date for that information to come here. So why are we doing this work? I mean, we've kind of covered this, and it's really important that we start to get a really good handle on it, and things are changing around the world, and things are changing specifically within New Zealand, especially after the Christchurch and Kaikoura earthquakes. We've learned a lot. We need to apply that back here. And there may be some benefits of this work. While we might be sitting here saying this is quite a negative conversation, Cam, the benefits of understanding this work is that we're sharing this information with our community to understand risk. We're putting our place and understanding that, but some of the work that we're doing around liquefaction and shaking may actually reduce long-term compliance because we will have specific understanding of our own areas rather than applying upon sort of a general New Zealand understanding. So there's positives here as well. Okay. So specifically around inner harbour erosion, the way in which we did this was we actually assessed the entire inner harbour for trends. We worked this collaboratively with the Regional Council in Western Bay. The reason why we've done this is it's better if we pull our resources, we get better skills, understanding, working together, and we share that knowledge and the funding. So there is a benefit to us in terms of that. Okay. This really, and the greatest extent, is looking at cliff face stability, and I'm not going to show you maps today, but I'm going to show you where you can go to those. A lot of this is around an individual property transaction, so we need to be quite conscious of that, so I haven't put it out as a public presentation. We've utilised a range of those sea level rise scenarios, as I've talked about, and what this does is it creates a range of hazard areas that incur into the land. In some cases with this erosion data, it's actually 2 properties deep over the full range of those scenarios to 1.6 metres. While this is a picture of the open coast and how it erodes, I actually find it really helpful and quite simple in terms of how a cliff face or a low-lying shoreline like Coolan Park, etc. will respond. And it's quite simple. You've essentially got an area that is currently up for erosion. Okay, it can happen any day because we have a range of storm events that can happen, undercutting of that over time. Okay. All we do is you say, as I talked about that equilibrium want to meet, you raise the sea, it wants to retreat back, and there is a long-term recession of that system. Okay, and it's pretty much as simple as that. In terms of our work, we've run a range of probabilistic scenarios, considering the mapping over 50 to 100 years. Okay, so we've produced a 2030 scenario with 0.13 metres of sea level rise, a 2050 scenario of the main RCPs, and a 2130 scenario of those main RCPs. It produces 9 erosion scenarios that we can map and project inland. The key thing with this erosion data is that we've worked on it rather than just saying what is the current angle of repose, what is sea level, raise sea level, draw a new line. We've run a range of probabilistic scenarios. So as an example, if we had 1,000 parameters, we change every single one of those and we run all of them over and over again, and we will get a percentile of when a line is produced. And in this case, we're working in 2 parts, a likely scenario and an extremely unlikely scenario, and we share both of those under those sea level rise scenarios. We haven't considered coastal protection structures in this work. There are a variety of coastal protection structures, some that council own, some that are privately owned, some that are being built today. We just don't have enough knowledge around that stuff that we can actually factor that into this work. And we've excluded areas like the Strand, Takitimu Drive and the port. That is mainly because the way in which those areas are being constructed is that they will respond vastly different to erosion and sea level rise, and there's also probably a long-term thinking that there would be an investment program around those critical infrastructures. Okay. We've gone and specifically looked at each of these sites in a general range, okay, and we've looked at aerial photographs, long-term erosion trends, etc. Okay. In terms of properties, and this includes council-owned land, so reserves, so a title is a property. These are the numbers. The black areas are where we haven't run the scenario. So a P66 is the likely scenario. That is, if all the scenarios are run for each of these sea level rise scenarios, that line is met or surpassed 66% of the time. So we actually have high certainty that erosion will occur in the maps that we've produced. We produce an extremely unlikely scenario, which is that in terms of the probabilistic scenarios, only 5% are breached. We map that also. The key thing is that this data produces, in terms of the final outcome of 1.6 metres, 1.243 properties affected. Okay, that translates into approximately 1,180 actual properties when you take out the council reserve titles. And that's how many letters went out yesterday. So we're dealing with a lot of properties, and when we put that into the conversation in terms of those same scenarios of buildings, in terms of that 2131.6 is actually 701 buildings within that space. We've tried to provide this to you in terms of those 3 time horizons we've got of both when property and when buildings generally could start to be affected. For us as a council, this is our roading assets. And while that might not be a significant number, just remember we've not included the state highways in this, so these are all the local roads, and within those local roads are water and wastewater assets. Okay. And the key thing is that we know that while we're reinforcing some of those structures now, it's the question over how we're going to deal with that long term. That's really where the resilience thing is really going to come into play, and understanding how we're going to manage those assets. And maybe importantly, why I raise this in terms of reserve, and I've singled reserves out over all other infrastructure assets. Our reserves are in fact probably the first line of defence, and they will be eroded and lost. Okay. So that is in hectares from erosion only. So let's just remember there's a lot. There's a lot on this slide, and there's a lot in the conversations I've had, and it's a sobering conversation, and it's kind of one of those ones which is, do I want to believe this? Do I not? Okay, there's a lot here, so let's just think about how this actually impacts upon our landowners. We've got to be really careful how we communicate this, and how you are communicating this also when people are contacting you. that is not just the erosion data, but it's actually the wider program, and that this isn't new for us. It's not new for our community. In fact, even within our harbour erosion, it's not new. It's just updated and improved. Okay? So the way in which we have released this data is in exactly the same way that we've developed the Integrated Stormwater Project and Tsunami Survive. The base has been to inform landowners first of that new information and what it means and where it can be viewed. So those letters went out yesterday. The key thing around letters going out yesterday is that they're likely to be received from Wednesday onwards. Okay. We will be releasing later this year the inundation work and the groundwater work as well. And it will follow the same matter. So each property gets a letter. It's a cover letter saying that this information is now available. It is on the Land Information Memorandum, which is a requirement that council produces when someone comes in to purchase property or understand about a property. There is an FAQ. There is a specific property map as all 9 scenarios projected through colour bands over that property. And then there is an area-wide map of the area. So as an example, on the back of the FAQ, there's an A3 showing Mongatapu. And that's really to the fact that this is a community-wide issue. It's not an individual property issue. Now, just a key thing on why we might be talking about why we're doing this. The reality is that it's not for us to hold information and not share that. But if we want to get into a legislative conversation, the Local Government Efficient Information Meeting Act has a requirement called Land Information Memorandum. That was created to empower purchasers in the real estate market to give them the information that could affect price. It is a requirement on the council that if it's information, there's a potential, it's known to the council, and it's property specific, it must go on the limb. There is no choice here. So while we might want to have the conversation of not doing this, the reality is that we would be in breach of our law. And therefore there's a liability on issue. So you're caught between a rock and a hard place. How do you do your plan change in your compact city? How do you reduce risk? How do we not tell our landowners we must? It's a must. So all hazard information that we know goes on the limbs. This is not new. Okay, I need to really stress this. It's not new. You get a limb, we've got hazard information, it's sitting there. There's general statements around liquefaction, the flooding from the 100-year flood event, all of that stuff is there. The Building Act applies to all of that information. It's got to be considered through that to ensure that the building is structurally sound to all natural hazards. And through subdivision process, there was a requirement after the Christchurch earthquakes. The RMA was updated to make natural hazards a matter of national importance, and requirements in the RMA were changed to consider risk, not just one event to consider risk. There's a range of scenarios to determine what is the risk profile for a specific property upon subdivision. Okay, so I'm hoping this is my last slide. These are while all that's quite the take-home message and we're focusing heavily on erosion, there's some take-homes that I think we need to start thinking about, not only through the resilience project, but through a range of other things. The key things with hazard management is that there's really only 4 options here. You're going to defend. So in the case of erosion, it's hard protection structures, and they have a shelf life. You're adapting. That means that you're choosing to understand the information and make choices around subdivision built form over time and adapting to that, and then ultimately retreating. All there is in terms of like a new greenfield area, if it is that high risk, we have to avoid it if we can't treat it and adapt. Okay? And long term, we're going to have to get into these spaces as these hazards start to become more susceptible to these risks and we start seeing water inundation, etc. There's going to be who's affected, who's going to lead that response, and council has a key component in that. We're then going to have to put the layers of multiple hazards in place. While we might be dealing with the conversation of erosion, when we put inundation, tsunami risk, there's a package of building blocks that we're going to have to get a handle on and put all those through the citywide risk assessment we talked about and think about how those all go together, because it's not a one hazard state shop anymore. It's all of these coming together. And there is a question over who's going to pay, right? It is clear, and insurance companies have been on notice for a long period of time. The insurance companies will not pay for climate change. Insurance is the business of risk. Sea level rise is a sure thing. They're not involved. And then there's the question on the planning horizon. We're trying to meet the MFE guidelines and the regional policy statements requirements. So we're giving a broad range of scenarios here to allow for judgment calls to be made. And in our website, which goes live after this meeting, there's an interactive web viewer where you can actually turn on and off the 9 scenarios off our homepage. Okay, you're just doing it now to see the effects of it. I'd say it's the world leading web viewer, but that's just because I built it with a few other people. I mean we, not me. And that allows you to actually turn on those scenarios. So you can actually look at what is the 2030 likely, the 2030 unlikely, and allows you to work through that, which is actually better than just while we send our landowner the letter, they can actually go on that tool and explore and determine their own risk profile based upon that information. So we're trying to be as helpful as we can while we're landing information in the broad range. There are judgment calls that need to be made. Okay, and then we've got to think about through the resilience project these assets. Okay, because we need to probably be thinking about how those assets are going to perform long term. And then there's communication. While we have been leading the conversation on Tsunami Survive, flooding and now erosion in the same format, this is not going to go away, and I'm pretty sure that my phone is going to start ringing hot pretty shortly from the receipt of these letters, and our elected members need to take a lead role in this communication. It's not something that we can actually shy away from. Okay.
Thank you, Campbell and Steve. Very excellent presentation. We will have time for some questions, but I will put some parameters around them. We've already been asked by Campbell that there is no debate about climate change, at least the CO2 part of climate change. And if I can restrain myself, I expect all other members can as well. And there's also no choice about whether we put this information on the LIM. So let's not traverse those subjects. Let us please, because we do have time frames today, let us keep questions straight and simple. You can say whatever you like when we pass the resolution and make a debate. You know, the floor is open. But when it's question time, please, specific questions. It's a huge amount of information, and we could probably question here until 5 o'clock. But let's go. Councillor Robson is first, then Councillor Stewart, Councillor Brown, Councillor Morris.
Yeah, look, Cam, your usual quality presentation. Thank you very much. Clear, easy to understand. My question is quite simply, looking at the New Zealand census debacle, we put stuff on viewer. You're saying people can go and look at stuff. What are we doing for those people who are not digitally able to do that? What are we doing to support all those people in our community for whom that is not a viable option to get understanding? How are we supporting them?
So the way in which we've sought to deal with the issue is work with the landowner first. So we've used our rating database. We've sent the letter. They get their full-scale map. They get an FAQ map. Okay. So that is essentially a hard copy that goes to all post boxes or letter boxes. So that's the first way in which you do so. And so you get all information in that one hit. You don't have to go to the website. It's the choice to go to the website. It's just that the website is I feel it's quite a useful tool to be able to turn scenarios on and off and understand this issue in the short, medium and long term, and also get more information around the uncertainties that sit around sea level rise. The second thing that we've got in that letter and on the website is the ability to come to our public open day. So I agree you've got to go to that web tool to book yourself in. I accept that. But I do also expect that most people probably read the letter and probably just turn up to that open day anyway. We've worked out, and so we've got 9 sessions in communities from the Mount through to Welcome Bay. And you can go in and you can book, but the reality is that if you get that letter, it's a call to me, and we've set up all of our customer services team, that they have been briefed on all this information, where the information sits, but if the call comes through, it comes through to me and Steve or to other staff that are specifically engaged on being able to answer those questions. It's probably the best I can do when we think about the transaction is with an individual landowner, not with a wider community. Your needs are a much wider community, in my opinion, but I'm trying to get directly to that targeted person and provide as many avenues as possible through hard copy letter, phone, web, open days to contact us.
So just supplementary to that, you've asked for our support that we step up to this. What do we do? Very simply, what do we do when people ring us? Do we direct them straight to the council number, to another number? What do we?
So the reality is when I think about support, I mean, you're going to get phone calls off this. Just in the same with the flood event work, I would suspect you get phone calls. I need you to be aware of this information, and I've made you aware through memorandum and that information. There is a general conversation that I would expect you to have with those, but in terms of the specifics, they get directed to myself and Steve. That's what our job is. That's what we're paid for. The website is full of information, and that web viewer is quite helpful, but also that they can come and speak with us. And so anyone that has the range of technical questions or a range of issues, it is better that we come and work on one-on-one. Over the phone, through letter, is not the helpful process here. It is actually coming directly and talking to staff, and at our open day sessions, it's not just going to be staff there, we're actually bringing our technical advisors and our regional council support staff as well. So there's a broad spectrum of being able to ask a range of questions from the general planning information to the technical staff to how Sea Level Rise operates, etc. So my suggestion is take those calls, forward them through to us. We're making ourselves available to be there for our community.
Put them to you through the council 57770
Correct.
Number, right?
So the reality is that I expect my phone to be quite busy. So we've set it up through our council system that they come through our normal one. They'll answer by the call centre. They'll either direct it straight to me or to my voice message if I can't pick it up, or they will create what's called a CCM. That's a transaction, which means that I will get an email and it will have the details, and I will then call them back. And that's our way of logging and knowing that we've had a full conversation with every single person. We're not missing anyone that's tried to engage with us.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart, your question?
Thank you. Through the chair to Steve. Was there any surprises with the 2000 soil tests that were done, or was it what might be expected for coastal areas?
The 2000 soil tests are just soil tests, so the surprises will come when the study gets started. The soil tests are from other projects around the city, and we've been gathering those for a number of years now, and this was a part of that purpose. So it's been a long-term process. There shouldn't be any surprises. We have a pretty good liquefaction map. It's just the studies are updated and the science has now been tested in Christchurch. We're expecting to have a lot more confidence with our maps now.
So they're still being analysed, these samples?
We are going to bid this week for a couple of consultants to do that for the whole city for us.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown?
Thank you, and thank you, Kim and Steve, also for the pre-meetings that we've had, so that today isn't a shock to us, but it probably will be to some other people in our community. First question is, can we please have your presentation uploaded to Stella so that we can access it? And I also note that anybody who can phone into, and the call centre can book them into any one of those 9 sessions. I said that they're 20-minute sessions. My main concern is that for a lot of that information is quite technical. You're talking, RCPs and a lot of technical speak, which is your everyday language, but how do we make it so simple, not dumbing it down, but how do we get through the really technical stuff to keep it simple? Look at the FAQs on the website. Is that our best place to go? Because that seems to be a lot more easier to understand than your, no disrespect, but very, very technical information, because it is technical. No doubt about that.
Yeah, the reality is that's not my everyday language. It's been a journey of learning myself, I must admit, along with our comms advisors as well. Look, if you want, if you want me to hang around or come back after this meeting, I'm happy to have a more one-on-one conversation to provide greater stuff. I'm just thinking for you, but the reality is it's really difficult to translate the technical into the general here, especially when we're dealing with a range of scenarios. It would be great if we just had one scenario and we said this is the sea level rise scenario we're working with. We don't have that. The FAQ, I think, is the most helpful tool here, along with the web viewer. But I suppose the simple messages here is that we're not being callous about this. Okay. We completely understand and expect the effects that this will have upon an individual, property and a family. We have to do this to understand the hazards across our city, and that this is not the first time we've turned our mind to this. So we're not singling anyone out. We need to determine a range of sea level rise scenarios, and there is a range of them, and there is uncertainty. And that we map these between 0.13 metres to 1.6 metres, and we're doing our best to show that range to allow everyone to best understand that. That's my simple messaging. That's probably how I'll start most of my conversations off with people.
And I guess, supplement for me, and I guess it will depend on that person's view as to how serious they take it, whether they go for the unlikely, the most likely, etc. So therefore they can be as informed as they choose to be. Would that be fair to say?
That's entirely right. So one of the reasons why we've got those 9 scenarios and why we've built that viewer is it allows a person to think about what their time horizons are and where their risk might sit. Am I going to take a risk-averse approach that I'm not going to go put myself in one of these hazard zones? It's very hard to find a place in the city that isn't going to have one of these anyway. But that's your point. Or am I looking at a 10-year horizon that I'm not concerned? Or do I just not worry about this? More often than not, we find that we have properties being traded without any form of consideration of all the flood hazard data we've got. That is because there is a choice being made from people around the property rather than the risk. And that's inherent in all of us and how we operate.
Thank you. And in line with Councillor Brown's comments about getting the public as much information as possible, we will look into, because this will be on YouTube obviously, but the slides will not sort of follow, so we may be able to get a split screen and get the slide presentations alongside, which would be very helpful, I think, because you've presented it very well verbally. Was Councillor Morris next? No. So any other questions? Okay, well, I'll move, if we have a seconder, Councillor Robson, that we receive the report titled Natural Hazards and Resilience Planning. And all you can really say is, wow, this is a lot of work, a lot of impact upon our community. This is just one level. We've already had some information too about the flood hazards, the sea level rise impact on housing. We're not only trying to create more housing, but we know we're going to lose some. And as that data becomes refined and explained, we know I often say we're the 4th smallest territorial area in the country, it's going to get smaller in terms of housing supply. So thank you for the presentation, and that's all I'll say right now. Morris, unless my seconder wishes to speak now. Yep.
Thank you,
Councillor
Mr.
Morris.
Chair. Just during the presentation, perusing the coastal erosion maps and the liquefaction maps and all the ones which were being mentioned, I think there's an opportunity for current and future council projects to really collaborate with the community, perhaps in a defensive role. I'm specifically been looking along the Coolum Park area and along the memorial to the Strand as well. There are likely erosion areas within the 2030 time frame. So perhaps there's an opportunity for us with current and potentially future projects to collaborate with our community around defending. I note that we had a submission about 9 months ago from a resident about opening up the riparian in Welcome Bay and removing some of the obstructions there. And again, that's another area where there is forecast erosion, so there's an opportunity as well as in this process.
Thank you. Councillor Brown, then Councillor Malloy.
Thank you. This is a very, very complex nature. We've been through this with the tsunami scenarios over the past however many years it's been a topic of discussion. I think this is about making sure our community's informed, but I would hate to see people panicking and absolutely losing sleep over this. It's about being informed. Not a today issue, it's the next 30, 50, 100 years, so just urge people to be informed but not to panic. And thank you, Ken, for all your hard work.
Thank you. Councillor Malloy.
Well done, Cam and team. Forewarned, I guess, is forearmed, and it's a space that we have to be in. So well done. But it does sort of get a bit scary for council, and in planning our resilience and funding our resilience, because we've got this, you've got tsunami, you've got earthquake, you've got rainstorm, flood events, and possibly even volcanic. And if we had to make them all foolproof tomorrow, the cost would be horrendous. So weaving our way through this this maze and doing it in a way that's sustainable is going to be incredibly difficult.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. It's an interesting report and something we have to do. But the other thing is that sometimes nature throws curveballs at us that we can't plan for. So no matter how much we plan for, these unexpected things do happen. But I'm sure the community will find it of interest, and it's something that we are required to do. So hence the report. Thanks.
Councillor Robson.
Yeah, I suppose just to make the point, this is core business. This is core business for this council. And for those people who occasionally look at council and wonder what purpose we serve, and sometimes we don't do the best job of communicating it. The quality of this work, the quality of this presentation, the implications of what's being discussed here, the complexity, the size of it, this is core business. This is one of the reasons your council exists.
No other speakers? Yeah, I think Councillor Morris brought an interesting point that we, in light of this information, particularly the coastal erosion, some things like boardwalks can become actually an assistance to the adjacent property owners, whereby we may, at 1.5, if predictions are true and it's 1.5 over 100 years, that's going to take out most things. But in the period until then, there can be an opportunity to protect the environment, improve it, and I think that's a conversation we should have with those property owners at some point. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. And an abstention from Mayor Greg Brownless would be noted. So we will adjourn for lunch. We shall reconvene at 1 o'clock. We have a few things to attend to at lunch, elected members, and we'll be going then to DC, whatever it is, the report from Abley in the open section first, and then the confidential reports. Apologies for those who may have been sitting waiting for that, but we will come to that at 1 o'clock. Thank you.